Issei Hyoudou woke up to the smell of miso soup, and the distinct feeling that something in the world had quietly rearranged itself while he slept. He blinked at the ceiling of his room. It was his ceiling, the same water stain shaped vaguely like a dragon that he had stared at 1,000 mornings before. His alarm clock read 6:40. Ordinary. Familiar. Except for the fact that someone was humming downstairs in a voice that was not his mother's, and that voice belonged to Rias Gremory. He sat up so fast his head spun. Rias never came to his house before school. Rias barely tolerated mornings at all. He pulled on a shirt, stumbled down the stairs, and found her standing at his stove in an apron that was definitely not hers, flipping a tamagoyaki with the calm expertise of someone who had done this every day for years. "Good morning, Issei." She smiled at him over her shoulder, and there was something different in the way she said his name. Warmer. Closer. Like there was no distance left to close. "I made breakfast. Sit down before it gets cold." "Rias, what are you doing in my kitchen?" She tilted her head, genuinely puzzled by the question, the way a person is puzzled when asked why the sky is blue. "Making you breakfast." "Is something wrong?" Nothing about this was wrong exactly, except that everything about it was wrong. He sat at the table because his legs did not seem to want to argue with him, and ate the tamagoyaki, which was excellent, and tried to remember if he had hit his head recently. Asia arrived next, letting herself in through the front door with a key he did not remember giving her, carrying a small paper bag of pastries from the bakery 2 streets over. "I got the ones with custard, since they're your favorite," she said, beaming at him like his existence in her room was the best part of her day. Kaneko trailed in behind her, quiet as always, but she sat down directly beside him instead of across the table, close enough that their shoulders touched, and did not move away. By the time he left for school he had counted 4 members of his own peerage behaving as though he were the center of a solar system he did not remember building. The walk to Kuoh Academy was worse. Girls he barely knew said good morning to him by name. A second year he had exchanged perhaps 6 words within his life waved at him from across the street with an enthusiasm usually reserved for celebrities. A group of first years near the gate went quiet and then erupted into whispers the moment he passed, and it was not the usual whispers, the ones that used to follow him around when he was known campus-wide as the resident pervert. These whispers had a different shape to them. Softer. Hopeful. Something had happened to him, or to the world, or possibly to everyone in it except him. He found Akino waiting by the school gate, which was not unusual in itself, except that she was waiting specifically for him, arms folded, an expression of exaggerated patience on her face that dissolved into delight the instant she saw him. "There you are." She fell into step beside him, closer than personal space usually allowed, and made no move to correct the distance. "I was beginning to think you were going to make me walk in alone. Akino, since when do we walk to school together?" She laughed, the sound easy and genuine. "Since always, Issei. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale. I feel like I woke up in someone else's life." "If it helps," she said, leaning in slightly, "it is a very good life. You should enjoy it." He wanted to enjoy it. Objectively, rationally, some old and embarrassing part of him that had spent years dreaming about exactly this kind of morning wanted to throw both hands in the air and declare victory. But the part of him that had fought devils and fallen angels and gods with broken swords for names knew better than to trust a gift that arrived without an explanation. Something had changed, and he intended to find out what. Homeroom did nothing to settle his nerves. Every girl in the class greeted him on his way to his seat, not with the polite indifference he was used to, but with genuine warmth, the kind that made eye contact and meant it. Even Murayama and Kates, who used to chase him around the school grounds with wooden swords for peeking through locker room walls, now sat 2 rows over exchanging glances that were unmistakably, achingly fond. He caught his own reflection in the classroom window and checked, for a full 3 seconds, that he was still himself. Same unremarkable brown hair. Same face that had never once been called handsome by anyone who was not currently trying to manipulate him. Nothing about his exterior had changed, which meant the change was in everyone else, or in the fabric of whatever reality he was currently standing in. At lunch, Zenobia sat across from him and unpacked 2 bento boxes, one of which she slid toward him without asking whether he wanted it. I made extra, she said, as though this were an explanation and not a mystery in itself. I know you like the pickled plum ones. Zenobia, we've never really eaten lunch together before. Not just the two of us. She frowned, not offended, just confused by the framing. We eat lunch together every day. Since when? Since I transferred here. She studied his face for a long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes, something more perceptive than the easy affection everyone else had been offering all morning. Issei. Do you actually not remember? It was the first honest crack in the strange, dreamlike warmth of the day, the first person who had looked at him and seen that something was wrong instead of simply accepting the new shape of things. He leaned forward. Remember what? Before she could answer, the classroom door slid open and Rias stepped through it, scanning the room until she found him, and her expression shifted from searching to relieved in the space of a heartbeat. She crossed the room without hesitation, sat down beside him on the bench, and rested a hand lightly over his. There's a club meeting after school, she said. Something's come up. I need you there. Zenovia's earlier question hung unanswered in the air between them, swallowed by the arrival of yet another girl treating him like the most important person in the room. He looked between the two of them, aware that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than an unusually affectionate morning. What kind of something? He asked. Rias's smile did not waver, but her grip on his hand tightened, just slightly, just enough that he felt it. The kind that doesn't belong in this world, she said. Not yet, anyway. The occult research club room looked exactly as he remembered it, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had changed entirely. The same old sofa. The same stained glass window throwing colored light across the floor. The same magic circle worked into the wood beneath the rug. If the world had rewritten itself around him, it had at least kept the set pieces. Rias stood by the window with her arms folded, and for the first time all day her expression carried none of the easy warmth from that morning. This was the face she wore before battle. Sit down, Issei. This is going to take a while to explain, and I doubt you're going to like it. He sat. Akino poured tea without being asked, the ritual familiar even if nothing else was, and took up her usual place at Rias's shoulder. Asia and Kaneko sat near the window. Kiba leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that was harder to read than the girl's, something closer to sympathy than concern. 3 days ago, Rias began, you were nearly killed on a mission. A stray devil, stronger than we expected, cornered you in the old church district. You survived, but only barely. And when you woke up the next morning, you didn't remember any of it. Not the fight. Not the 6 months before it. You didn't remember that we're together, Issei. You looked at me like a stranger. He opened his mouth to say that this was not entirely accurate, that in his memory the 6 months in question had never happened at all, that as far as he was concerned he had woken up that morning from an ordinary life into an extraordinarily strange one. But something in her voice, tight and careful, made him hold the words back and listen instead. We didn't tell you, Akino continued, gentler than Rias but no less serious, because the club decided it might be dangerous to force the memories back all at once. Whatever hit you during that fight didn't just knock you out. It did something to your mind, something none of us fully understand yet. We've been trying to give you time. Space to either remember naturally, or to build new memories good enough to stand in for the old ones. That's why everyone's been, he gestured vaguely, searching for a word that would not sound as strange out loud as it felt in his head, like this. Because you all think I lost 6 months of a relationship with each of you. Rias's jaw tightened. It isn't a trick, Issei. It isn't a performance. We didn't decide to be close to you because of the accident. We were already close to you. The accident just took the memory of it away from you and left the rest of us standing here, still in love with someone who doesn't remember loving us back. The room went very quiet. He believed her. That was the strange part, the part that made the whole morning tilt sideways in his understanding. He believed every word, because there was nothing performative in the way she said it, nothing that read as an act designed to manipulate him. And yet something about the explanation did not sit right, some instinct honed over years of dealing with beings who lied for a living telling him that the story, however sincerely delivered, was not the whole truth. Rias. He kept his voice even. Can I ask you something and have you answer honestly, even if it's not what you want to tell me? She nodded, wary. Does everyone feel this way about me? Not just the people in this room. Everyone. The question landed harder than he expected. Akino's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Asia looked down at her hands. Kiba's arms uncrossed slowly, and for the first time that day, he spoke. That's the part we haven't figured out how to explain to you yet, Kiba said. It isn't just us, Issei. It's the whole school. It might be the whole town. We've been quietly asking around since the accident, and near as we can tell, there isn't a single girl within a few miles of you who doesn't feel some kind of pull toward you. Students. Teachers. People who've never spoken to you in their lives suddenly know your name. That's not what a memory injury does, Issei said slowly. No, Rias agreed. It isn't. The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific heaviness of people in a room who all understood something and were reluctant to be the one to say it aloud first. So what actually happened to me in that fight, he asked. Rias exchanged a look with Akino, some silent negotiation passing between them, and then she crossed the room and knelt in front of him so that they were eye level, close enough that he could see the worry she had been carefully keeping out of her voice. The stray devil we fought wasn't ordinary, she said. It was carrying something. A relic, or a fragment of one, something old enough that none of us recognized its make. When it struck you, that fragment activated. We felt it happen. The air itself changed color for a moment, like a filter had been laid over the whole district. And ever since then, this is what the world looks like around you. A curse, or a blessing, depending on who you ask. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Most of the club would rather call it a curse. Something did this to you without your consent, and it's rewritten how every woman in range perceives you, whether they want it rewritten or not. That isn't affection freely given. It's affection with the choice taken out of it. Which is precisely why we need to find whoever, or whatever, planted that relic, and undo it, before it spreads any further than it already has. He sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Somewhere underneath the disorientation of the morning, underneath the surreal comfort of being wanted by everyone he passed, a colder thought settled into place. If this was a curse, then everyone around him right now, Rias included, might be feeling something that was not entirely their own. Do you believe what you feel for me is real? He asked her quietly. Or do you think the relic put it there? Her eyes did not waver. I think the relic amplified something that already existed. I think that's worse, not better, because now I can't fully trust my own certainty, and neither can you. That's what we're going to fix. Not because what's between us doesn't matter. Because it should be allowed to be real, without something else's hand on the scale. Kiba pushed off the wall. We've got a lead. A dealer in the underground market who might know where the fragment originally came from. It's not a safe conversation to have alone, and it's definitely not one you should have with half the female population of this town suddenly treating you like the answer to their prayers. Issei looked around the room, at Rias still kneeling in front of him with her hand resting on his knee, at Akino's carefully composed calm, at Asia's quiet worry and Kaniko's watchful stillness, and felt, for the first time since he had opened his eyes that morning, something solid to hold on to. Not the strange gravity pulling every girl in town toward him. Something steadier than that. All right, he said. Then let's go find out who did this to me. Rias finally allowed herself to smile, small and real. That's the Issei I remember. Outside the clubroom window, the afternoon light shifted, and somewhere beyond the school grounds, something that had been watching the occult research club for the better part of the day finally moved. The underground market did not look like much from the surface. A narrow stairwell behind a shuttered noodle shop, a door with no handle on the outside, a password that changed every week and that Kiba produced without hesitation. Issei followed him down into a space that smelled of old parchment and ozone, lined with stalls selling things that had no business being sold, bottled screams, teeth that still had names attached to them, a birdcage with nothing visible inside it that nonetheless rattled every few seconds as though something were pacing. Rias had insisted on coming, over Issei's objection that the fewer women in the room, the fewer complications they would run into. She walked a step ahead of him now, posture regal, every inch the heir to a devil house, and the dealers along the row watched her with the particular wariness reserved for people who could burn the whole market down if they felt like it. Grigory, Kiba said, stopping at a stall near the back, tended by a hunched figure whose face was hidden beneath a wide hood. We're looking for information on a relic. Old. Fragmentary. Turns up in the hands of strays that shouldn't be strong enough to carry it. The hooded figure went very still. You're the boy, it said, and the voice was neither male nor female, low and dry like paper scraping paper. The one it found. Issei stepped forward. You know what happened to me. I know what the fragment does. I don't know why it chose you. The dealer's head tilted, studying him with an attention that felt like being weighed on a scale he could not see. It's called the heart glass. Old thing. Older than most of the factions still arguing over who gets to run this world. It doesn't create feeling where none exists. It finds what's already there, buried or denied or too small to notice, and it magnifies it until it can't be ignored anymore. Every woman in your range who's ever felt anything for you, however small, however unacknowledged, is feeling it now at full volume. That's not a fair trade, Rias said sharply. Amplifying a feeling without consent isn't romance. It's theft. It steals the choice of how loudly to feel something. I don't design the relics, devil. I only know what they do. The dealer's attention slid back to Issei. The good news, if you want to call it that, is that the heart glass burns itself out. It isn't meant to be permanent. It's meant to be a spark, not a fire that runs forever. The bad news is what happens right before it burns out. Which is what? Issei asked, already certain he would not like the answer. It concentrates. As the effect fades from the wider radius, it doesn't just fade evenly. It collapses inward, toward whoever's feeling for you is strongest, and for one night, right before the end, that feeling burns hot enough to reshape whoever's carrying it. Strength. Desperation. Grief, most likely, boy, if the feeling underneath was ever grief to begin with. You'll want to be somewhere safe when that happens. And you'll want to know who around you feels the strongest, because that's where the danger's going to come from. Kiba's hand drifted toward the hilt at his side. How long until it burns out? 3 days, the dealer said. Maybe 4, if the boy's lucky. It arrived in him during a fight, which means whoever set that stray devil loose knew exactly what they were doing. Somebody wanted this on him. The heart glass isn't cheap, and it isn't easy to steal from wherever it's kept. Somebody spent a great deal to make every woman in this town fall for a boy they'd otherwise have never looked at twice. Why? Rias demanded. What's the purpose of doing that to him? The dealer shrugged, a slow rustling motion beneath the hood. Chaos, maybe? Or bait. A boy that every woman in a 5-mile radius would burn the world down to protect is a very useful hostage to have, if you're the sort of person who likes leverage. I'd start looking at who benefits from this town's devils, angels, and everyone in between being distracted and divided over one high school boy's sudden popularity. Issei felt the floor of the conversation shift under him, the same way it had shifted that morning in the kitchen, except this time the ground opening up beneath him had teeth. Somebody had done this on purpose. Somebody had turned every woman who cared about him, even a little, into a fuse burning down towards something none of them could see the end of yet. 3 days, he repeated. 3 days, the dealer agreed. I'd spend them wisely, boy. And I'd figure out, quickly, who around you feels the strongest, because when the heart glass collapses, that's where the whole thing's going to land. Rias's hand found his in the dim light of the stall, and this time there was nothing dreamlike or uncertain in the way she held it. This was the same grip she used before a fight, steady and sure. Then we go home, she said, and we find out who set this in motion, before it decides for us who pays the price. They left the market the way they came, up through the noodle shop, out into the ordinary evening air of a town that had no idea a clock was quietly running out above its rooftops. Issei walked between Rias and Kiba, turning the dealer's words over and over, and could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the crowd of faces they passed on the way home, someone was already watching, already counting down the same 3 days, and already smiling at how close they were to whatever it was they actually wanted. Sona Sitri was waiting for them when they returned to the old schoolhouse, seated behind Rias's desk with the composed stillness of someone who had been expecting exactly this conversation and had simply chosen to have it on her own terms. Tsubaki stood at her shoulder silent, a folder of papers held against her chest. "You went to the underground market without telling me," Sona said, not quite a question. "We didn't think it concerned your territory," Rias answered, though the edge in her voice suggested she already suspected otherwise. "Everything happening to that boy concerns my territory." Sona's glasses caught the light as she turned to look at Issei directly, and there was none of the strange warmth in her gaze that had colored every other woman's expression that day. If anything, she looked faintly relieved to find someone who could meet her eyes without swooning. "You're immune to my notice, which tells me the heart glass has limits. I've felt nothing shift in myself since the incident. Whatever radius that thing operates in, it apparently doesn't touch me." "Small mercies," Kiba muttered. "Not mercy. Data." Sona folded her hands. "I've spent the last 3 days quietly cataloging which women in this town are affected and to what degree, because someone had to, and clearly none of you were doing it while you were busy making him breakfast." The look she gave Rias was withering. "The pattern isn't random. It scales with proximity and prior familiarity. Strangers feel a mild pull. Acquaintances feel considerably more. And anyone with an existing emotional foundation, however small, is experiencing something close to obsession." Issei's stomach tightened. "You're saying it's going to get worse before it burns out." "I'm saying the dealer in the market told you the truth, which in my experience with that particular merchant is rare enough to be worth taking seriously." Sona opened the folder Tsubaki had been holding and spread several pages across the desk. Names, columns, a hand-drawn map of the town with small marks radiating outward from a point that Issei recognized, uncomfortably, as roughly where his house stood. "I've narrowed the strongest concentrations to 12 individuals. All of them known to you personally. All of them, notably, already members of your peerage or your circle of friends." "That doesn't tell us who set the trap," Rias said. "No. But it tells us where the danger will land when it collapses." Sona tapped one name on the list, and Issei leaned forward to read it, a small cold feeling settling into his chest even before he saw it. "The dealer said the effect concentrates toward whoever feels the strongest. Based on my observations over the last 3 days, that isn't close. It's you, Rias, by a significant margin. Which means when this thing burns out, whatever transformation the dealer described is going to happen to the woman standing closest to him. That's not a hypothetical danger. That's a certainty, unless we intervene first." The room went quiet. Rias did not look away from Sona, did not flinch, but her hand found the edge of the desk and gripped it. "Then we intervene," she said. "With what plan exactly?" Sona's tone was not unkind, but it was precise, the tone of someone who had already run through every option and found most of them wanting. "You can't remove feeling that was already there before the relic touched it. The dealer was clear on that. This isn't a possession to be exorcised. It's an amplifier attached to something real. The only way to stop the collapse from doing damage is to find the relic's source and either destroy the fragment, or draw it out of him before the 3 days are up." "Can that be done?" Issei asked. "Drawing it out?" Sona's expression flickered, the first genuine uncertainty he had seen from her all evening. "In theory. There are extraction rituals old enough to predate most of the current factions, techniques the Fallen used to use on captured sacred gear wielders before the treaties made that sort of thing illegal. I know one person who might still remember how to perform one safely. She's not going to want to help." "Who?" "Azazel," Sona said, and watched the name land on every face in the room with a different weight. "He's been keeping a low profile since the ceasefire, officially retired from anything resembling fieldwork, but he still knows more about relic craft than anyone alive who isn't currently trying to end the world with it. If anyone can pull that fragment out of you without killing you in the process, it's him." Rias's jaw tightened at the mention of the name, an old wariness surfacing that had nothing to do with the heart glass and everything to do with history Issei only half remembered the details of. "He'll want something in return. He always does. Then we give him something small enough to afford and refuse to give him anything larger," Sona said. "We don't have the luxury of pride right now. We have 2 days left, Maybe 3 if the dealer's estimate was generous, and a very short list of people capable of helping us before this decides the outcome for us. Issei looked around the room, at Rias's carefully held composure, at Sona's clinical focus that he suspected was covering just as much worry as anyone else's, and felt the shape of the next 2 days settle over him like a weight he had not asked to carry but would carry anyway, because the alternative was watching it fall on someone else instead. Then let's go find Azazel, he said. Before this decides for us. Sona closed the folder and rose from behind the desk, already moving toward the door with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting all evening for permission to act. I already know where he's hiding. I just needed you all to agree it was worth the trouble of asking him. She paused at the doorway and looked back, and for just a moment the composed mask slipped enough to show something like genuine concern underneath. For what it's worth, Issei, whatever the relic amplified in Rias, I don't think it invented anything that wasn't already there. That doesn't make what happened to you fair. But it might make what you're about to try to save easier to justify. She left before anyone could answer, and the room settled back into a silence that felt different than the one before, heavier with understanding, lighter with the small relief of finally having somewhere to point their effort. Rias crossed to where Issei stood and rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder, not asking for anything, just needing the contact for a moment before whatever came next. 2 days, she said quietly. 2 days, he agreed, and put his arms around her, and did not let go for a long while. Azazel's hideout turned out to be an unremarkable apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town, the kind of place nobody would ever suspect housed one of the most dangerous minds in the supernatural world. He answered the door in a rumpled shirt with a mug of coffee in hand, took one look at the group assembled on his landing, Rias, Sona, Kiba, and Issei standing slightly apart from the rest, and sighed with the particular weariness of a man who had hoped retirement would last longer than it had. Let me guess, he said, stepping aside to let them in. The heart glass. You knew, Rias said sharply, following him inside. I suspected, the moment Sona's message mentioned a boy suddenly beloved by every woman in a 3-mile radius, and a stray devil strong enough to carry a relic it shouldn't have been able to hold. There aren't many things in the world that do exactly that, and fewer still that anyone would bother stealing for the specific purpose of using on a teenager. He gestured them toward a cluttered table, sweeping aside a stack of old research papers to clear space. Sit. Let's see how much damage we're dealing with. He examined Issei with a focus that felt uncomfortably clinical, tilting his head one way and then another, and finally pressed 2 fingers lightly against his sternum, closing his eyes in concentration. Yeah, Azazel said after a moment, withdrawing his hand. It's in there deep. Wrapped itself around your aura the way ivy wraps a fence post. Whoever set this loose on you knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't opportunistic. This is planned, and planned well. Can you get it out? Sona asked, cutting straight past the commentary to the only question that mattered. Probably. The extraction ritual isn't complicated, technically speaking. It's dangerous, because pulling a relic fragment out of someone's soul carries real risk if it's done wrong, and because whoever set this trap almost certainly built in some kind of failsafe for exactly this scenario. People who go to this much trouble rarely leave the door unlocked. Azazel rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. I'll need components I don't currently have. Blessed silver, a working circle drawn in something older than chalk, and a focal point strong enough to anchor the extraction without letting the fragments scatter into the nearest available vessel. Meaning what? Issei asked. Meaning if this goes wrong, the fragment doesn't just vanish. It looks for somewhere else to land, and given how deeply it's already rooted itself in the emotional landscape around you, the nearest available vessel is very likely going to be whoever's standing closest to you when the ritual happens. Azazel's eyes flicked to Rias, and the weight of that look was not lost on anyone in the room. So we're going to need to be extremely careful about who's present. Rias did not move. I'm not leaving. I didn't say leave. I said careful. Azazel began pulling books from a nearby shelf, flipping through pages with the speed of long familiarity. Give me until tomorrow evening to gather what I need and prepare the circle properly. In the meantime, I want all of you to do something that's going to sound strange given the circumstances. Which is, Kiba prompted. Stay close to him. All of you. Especially the ones feeling this thing the strongest. Azazel did not look up from his books. I know the instinct is to pull back, to give him space, maybe to isolate him somewhere safe until this is over. Don't. The heart glass feeds on distance and uncertainty as much as it feeds on proximity. Every hour any of you spend anxious and separated from him is an hour the relic has to work with, twisting that anxiety into something sharper. Keep him surrounded by people who are calm and certain about how they feel, and you blunt its ability to do exactly what it's built to do, which is escalate. That sounds like a convenient excuse for you to avoid doing any actual work tonight, Sona said flatly. Azazel grinned, unrepentant. It's both, Sona. I contain multitudes. They left the apartment as the sun was setting, the sky over Kuoh bruising orange and violet in a way that felt almost cruelly beautiful given the circumstances. Rias walked close beside Issei the entire way home, her hand finding his without either of them commenting on it, and for once he did not question the closeness or wonder how much of it belonged to her, and how much belonged to whatever had been planted inside him. Azazel's words sat with him the whole walk. Whatever the relic had amplified, it had not invented. Somewhere underneath the artificial urgency of a curse with a countdown attached to it, there was something real, something that had presumably always been there, quietly waiting for a chance to be acknowledged. That did not make the danger any smaller. It only made the stakes feel more complicated, more personal, and the thought of losing Rias to whatever transformation the collapse might trigger settled into his chest with a weight heavier than anything the relic itself had done to him. You're thinking too loudly, Rias said without looking at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. I can practically hear it. Just thinking about tomorrow. Don't. She squeezed his hand. Azazel's going to fix this. And even if something goes wrong, I'm not going anywhere, Issei. Whatever that thing does to me, I'll still be me underneath it. Remember that, if it comes down to it. He wanted to believe her completely. He walked the rest of the way home holding on to that hope with both hands, aware that somewhere out there, whoever had set this trap in motion was almost certainly watching the countdown tick toward its final hours with a patience that suggested they had never doubted, for even a moment, exactly how this was going to end. Overhead, the first stars came out over Kuoh, indifferent to the quiet war being fought beneath them. Morning brought no relief. Issei woke to find the strange gravity of the previous days had not eased overnight. If anything, it had sharpened, every interaction carrying an intensity that made the ordinary rhythms of school feel like walking through a room full of held breath. He kept close to Rias and the others as Azazel had instructed, and for most of the morning it seemed to work, the constant presence of familiar, steady people acting like ballast against whatever storm was building beneath the surface of the town. It was during the lunch period that things went wrong. He felt it before he understood it, a prickling awareness at the back of his neck that years of supernatural skirmishes had taught him to trust without question. He was crossing the courtyard with Kiba when the air changed, the same way Rias had described the church district changing color during the original attack, a subtle wrongness settling over the school grounds like a held note about to break. Kiba, I feel it too. Kiba's hand drifted to his side, though he carried no visible weapon in the daylight hours of an ordinary school day. Something's here. The something announced itself a moment later in the form of a woman none of them recognized, stepping out from beneath the shade of the courtyard's largest tree as though she had simply been waiting there the entire time, patient as stone. She wore clothes that belonged to no particular era, dark and unremarkable, and her eyes when they found Issei carried none of the warmth every other woman in town had been directing at him for days. They carried something closer to hunger, cold, and calculating. There you are, she said. I was starting to think Azazel's little council of war was going to keep you locked away until the collapse made this easier for me. Who are you? Issei demanded, already moving to put himself between her and the students still crossing the courtyard, oblivious to the danger standing among them. A name won't mean anything to you yet. It will, before this is over. She smiled, and it did not reach the rest of her expression. I set the hard glass on you 3 days ago because I needed something reliable to happen in this town, something predictable enough to plan around. Devils are difficult to manipulate directly. Their hearts, however, are wonderfully easy to weaponize once you know which one to point at a target and pull. You did this on purpose. To hurt people. I did this to create leverage, she corrected, unbothered. There's a difference, though I understand why it might not feel like one to you. When the heart glass collapses tonight, it's going to leave someone very powerful in a very vulnerable state, and I intend to be standing close enough to make use of that vulnerability before your friends have a chance to recover from it. Rias Gremory, heir to one of the great houses, transformed by grief and want into something raw enough to bargain with. That's worth a great deal to the right buyer. Kiba's expression went cold. You're planning to take her while she's compromised. I'm planning to offer her a very simple trade. Power to match whatever the collapse leaves behind, in exchange for loyalty to whoever provides it. The woman's gaze slid back to Issei, and something in it sharpened with genuine interest. You're a curious variable in all of this, by the way. The heart glass isn't supposed to leave its host so clear-headed. Most carriers lose themselves a little to the amplification, start believing the attention is deserved, start enjoying it a bit too much to fight against it. You haven't. That's inconvenient for me, and mildly impressive besides. I'm not going to let you touch her. You won't have a choice, Dragon Boy. Not tonight, when the collapse takes everything you have left to give and leaves you with nothing to fight with. She stepped back into the shade of the tree, already turning away, unhurried, utterly confident in the shape of her own plan. Tell Azazel I said hello, and that his extraction ritual is going to fail. I made certain of that particular fail-safe personally. Enjoy your lunch. She was gone before either of them could close the distance, not vanishing exactly, simply no longer being where she had stood a moment before, the way certain old and patient things moved when they did not wish to be followed. Kiba swore under his breath, something he rarely did, and immediately pulled out his phone to alert the others. Issei stood rooted to the spot, her words circling in his head with a cold, methodical persistence. The extraction ritual is going to fail. I made certain of that particular fail-safe personally. If Azazel's plan was compromised, then whatever happened tonight was going to happen regardless of anything they tried to do to stop it. Rias was going to be standing closest to him when the heart glass collapsed, exactly as Sona had calculated, exactly as the woman beneath the tree had planned for from the very beginning. Every choice they had made over the last 3 days, every careful, well-intentioned step toward safety, had been walking them steadily toward a trap built with their own good instincts as the bait. We need to tell Rias, Issei said. Now. Before the club meeting. And Azazel, Kiba added grimly, already moving toward the school building. If his ritual's compromised, we need a backup plan before tonight, not after. They found Rias in the clubroom an hour later, and watched her expression harden into something fierce and unafraid as she listened to the account of the courtyard confrontation, and Issei understood, watching her, that whatever the heart glass had amplified in her, courage had clearly always been part of the original. Then we go into tonight with our eyes open, she said, when the account was finished. If she wants to use the collapse as a trap, we make sure there's nothing left for her to catch when it happens. How? Sona asked, arriving in time to hear the tail end of the plan and already pulling a chair out to join the strategy session properly. Rias's eyes found Issei's, steady and certain despite everything closing in around them. By making sure I'm not standing there alone when it happens. By making sure all of us are. Outside the clubroom window, the afternoon light stretched long and gold across the courtyard, counting down, indifferent, toward the night that was already coming for them regardless of how ready they were to meet it. Azazel's apartment had transformed by nightfall into something closer to a war room than a hideout. He had cleared every table and shoved the furniture against the walls to make space for a circle drawn in a chalk that shimmered faintly silver under the lamplight. Old symbols worked into its edges that made Issei's eyes water slightly if he looked at them too long. Sona stood near the door reviewing a final checklist with Tsubaki. Kiba paced the perimeter of the room, weapon drawn now that they were somewhere private enough to justify it. Akino, Asia, and Kaneko had all come as well, positioned at intervals around the circle the way Azazel had instructed, close enough to Issei to blunt the heart glass's escalation, far enough from the center to stay out of the ritual's direct path. Rias stood closest to him, exactly where the danger predicted she would be, and had refused every suggestion that she stand elsewhere. I heard what that woman told you in Kiba, she said, when Issei tried once more to talk her into stepping back. If she wants to catch me at my most vulnerable, she can try. But I'm not going to make this easier for her by hiding from the people who'd actually be here to help me through it. Rias. I mean it, Issei. Whatever's coming for me tonight, I'd rather face it standing next to you than safely tucked away somewhere alone, wondering what happened. Her hand found his, steady despite everything. That's not the amplification talking. That's just who I am. He wanted to argue further and found he had no good argument left, only worry, which was not the same thing. Azazel emerged from a back room carrying a small silver bowl filled with something that smoked faintly and smelled of ash and old rain. He knelt at the edge of the circle and began arranging components with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who had done dangerous things many times before and had learned, the hard way, exactly what happened when precision was sacrificed for speed. I want to be honest with all of you before we start, he said, without looking up from his work. A source came to me an hour ago and confirmed what Issei and Kiba already suspected. Someone tampered with the extraction ritual's failsafe. I found it, a corrupted rune buried 3 layers deep in the circle's binding sequence, something that would have redirected the fragment straight into whoever was standing closest when the extraction pulled it free. Into me, Rias said quietly. Into you, Azazel confirmed. I've fixed it, as far as I can tell, but I want to be clear that fixed doesn't mean guaranteed. Whoever built that failsafe knew this circle's language well enough to corrupt it without leaving obvious fingerprints, which tells me they're old, patient, and considerably more skilled than the average relic dealer looking for a quick profit. I don't know everything they might have hidden in here. I only know what I found and repaired. Sona's expression sharpened. Then we proceed with the assumption that there may be contingencies you haven't found. We proceed with the assumption that there's always a contingency you haven't found, Sona. That's just how this business works. Azazel finally looked up, meeting each of their eyes in turn, serious in a way that felt startling coming from someone who usually wore amusement like armor. Here's the truth of tonight. I can pull the heart glass fragment out of Issei. I'm confident of that much. What I can't guarantee is what happens in the half-second between the fragment leaving him and the circle containing it fully. If our uninvited friend built any secondary traps into this ritual, that's the window they'll try to use. So we close the window, Kiba said. We do our best to. Which is why I want everyone positioned exactly where I've placed you, and I want absolute stillness once the extraction begins, no matter what you see or hear happening inside that circle. Movement disrupts the containment. Panic disrupts it faster. Azazel's gaze settled on Issei last, and something almost gentle crept into it. This is going to hurt. I won't lie to you about that. Pulling something rooted this deep out of a person's aura isn't painless, and I need you conscious and steady through the worst of it, because the ritual needs your intent as an anchor, not just your body as a vessel. Issei nodded, throat tight. Do it. Azazel rose, dusted off his knees, and gestured for Issei to step into the center of the circle. Rias's hand slipped from his as he crossed the threshold, and the loss of that contact felt sharper than it should have, a small cold absence in the middle of everything else that was about to go wrong or right depending on the next few minutes. The circle came alive the moment Azazel began the incantation, silver light climbing up through the chalk lines and wrapping around Issei's ankles, his knees, spiraling upward with a low hum that he felt more in his chest than in his ears. It did not hurt yet. It felt, if anything, like being slowly submerged in warm water, a gentle pressure building from every direction at once. Steady, Azazel murmured, eyes fixed on the circle's shifting patterns, hands moving through a sequence of gestures too fast and too precise to follow. It's finding the fragment now. Just hold still. The gentle pressure sharpened into something else entirely the moment the light reached his sternum, a hook of cold fire sinking into his chest and pulling, and Issei's knees buckled before he could stop them, a sound tearing out of his throat that he did not fully recognize as his own voice. Somewhere outside the circle he heard Asia gasp, heard Rias take a half-step forward before catching herself and staying rooted where Azazel had placed her, heard Akino's sharp intake of breath. Almost there, Azazel said, tighter now, sweat beating at his temple despite the room's cool air. Stay with me, Issei. Don't let go yet. The pain climbed to a peak that whited out the edges of his vision, the sensation of something vast and old being torn free of roots it had spent 3 days growing deep into the fabric of who he was. And then, all at once, it broke. The silver light collapsed inward with a sound like a struck bell, and for one suspended half-second the fragment hung visible in the center of the circle, a shard of pale glass no larger than a fingernail, pulsing faintly with a light of its own. And then the corrupted rune Azazel had missed, the one buried a 4th layer deeper than the 3 he had found and repaired, activated exactly as it had been designed to. The fragment did not settle into the containment vessel waiting for it. It shot sideways, fast as a struck spark, straight toward the nearest source of overwhelming feeling in the room, and every single person present understood, in the half-instant before it happened, exactly where that was going to land. Rias moved before the fragment did, which should not have been possible against something moving at that speed, except that some instinct older than conscious thought sent her stepping directly into its path a half-breath before it would have reached her anyway, as though refusing to let it choose the moment of impact for her. The fragment struck her just below the collarbone and vanished into her the way a stone vanishes into still water, a small silence swallowing a great deal of noise all at once. For a moment nothing happened. Rias stood exactly where she had been standing, breathing, blinking, apparently unharmed, and Issei felt a wild, desperate hope flare in his chest that perhaps this was survivable, perhaps the fragment had simply dissolved harmlessly into her the way it had been meant to dissolve into the containment vessel. Then her eyes changed color. It was subtle at first, a deepening of the blue-green that had always been there, shifting towards something closer to molten gold at the edges, and her breathing turned ragged, and she pressed both hands to her chest as though trying to physically hold something in that had suddenly become too large for the space it occupied. Rias! Issei was moving before Azazel could stop him, crossing the circle's dissolving boundary to reach her, and this time nobody tried to hold him back. She looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something raw and unguarded and frightened, stripped of every careful composure she usually wore like a second skin. Issei, I feel, she stopped, swallowed, tried again. I feel too much. All of it, all at once. Everything I've ever felt about you, every time I told myself to wait, to be patient, to not overwhelm you with it. It's not waiting anymore, that's all right. He caught her hands, steadying them against his own chest. That's all right, Rias. I'm right here. You don't understand. Her grip tightened almost painfully, gold light beginning to flicker faintly beneath her skin, visible now even through her sleeves. This isn't just feeling more of what was already there. It's demanding somewhere to go. I can feel it looking for a shape to take, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to be the one who decides what shape that is. Azazel was already moving, shouting instructions, Issei only half absorbed through the roar of his own panic, something about a secondary containment, about buying time, about needing everyone to stay close and calm because distance and fear would only feed whatever was building in her. Sona was at Rias's other side within seconds, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist, reading something in her pulse that made her expression go tight and clinical. Her devil energy is spiking, Sona said. Fast. If this doesn't find an outlet in the next few minutes, it's going to force one, and I don't think any of us want to be in the room when that happens uncontrolled. Then we give it an outlet, Aquino said, already crossing the room to Rias's side, laying a hand flat against her back. Together. All of us. We anchor her the way we anchored the extraction, except this time we don't let anything corrupted get near it. Asia was there a moment later, small hands glowing faintly green with the beginning of a healing casting, and Kaneko pressed close on Rias's other side without needing to be told, and even Kiba abandoned his post at the circle's edge to add whatever steadying presence he could offer. For a moment the room held its breath collectively, 6 people forming a loose circle of their own around the woman at its center, none of them entirely certain what they were bracing for. Rias's breathing began to slow, gradually, the gold light beneath her skin dimming from a frantic flicker to something steadier, still present but no longer straining against its own edges. She looked up at Issei again, and this time there was less fear in her expression and more something quieter, something that had found, if not calm exactly, at least a shape it could hold on to. It's not gone, she said softly. I don't think it's ever fully going to be gone, not completely. But it's mine now. Whatever the relic did, I think it's finished doing it. What's left is just me. Are you certain? Sona asked, still watching her pulse with clinical care. I'm certain. Rias managed something close to a real smile, exhausted but genuine. It's strange. I think I finally understand what the dealer meant, about it amplifying what was already there rather than creating something new. Everything I felt tonight, however overwhelming it was mine to begin with. The relic just made it too loud to keep pretending otherwise. Azazel exhaled a long breath he had apparently been holding for some time and sank down against the nearest wall, looking abruptly and thoroughly exhausted. Well, that's not exactly how I expected tonight to end, but I'll take a live, coherent Gremory air over the alternative I was bracing for. The corrupted rune, Kiba said, voice hard. It worked exactly the way that woman told Issei it would. Which means she's still out there, and she's not going to be pleased that her plan didn't produce the vulnerable, biddable outcome she was hoping for. No, Azazel agreed grimly, pushing himself back to his feet despite his exhaustion. She's not going to be pleased at all. Which means we should all assume this isn't over, no matter how relieved we are that tonight didn't go the way she wanted. Issei kept his arms around Rias, feeling the last of the tremors ease out of her, and thought, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given to him by any relic, that whatever came next, they would face it the same way they had faced tonight. Together, and on their own terms, and not on whichever terms an old and patient enemy had been trying to force onto them from the shadows. Outside, the night had gone fully dark over Kuoh, and somewhere within it, a woman who had been counting on a different outcome was already recalculating. The days that followed the extraction settled into something that almost resembled normal, if normal could be redefined to include a devil air occasionally catching herself mid-sentence, and laughing softly at how unguarded she had become about saying exactly what she felt. The wider effect of the heart glass faded from the rest of the town within a day, students and teachers and strangers alike returning to their ordinary, indifferent relationship with a boy most of them had never had reason to notice before. Only the people closest to him kept anything of what the relic had touched, and what remained in them was, as Rias had said, simply theirs, no longer amplified past recognition, just present and acknowledged in a way it perhaps had not been before. Issei told himself this counted as a victory, and mostly believed it, except for the small persistent unease of knowing the woman responsible was still out there, and had promised, in her own quiet way, that this was not finished. She reappeared 8 days later, not in the courtyard this time but in a place far more deliberately chosen, waiting for him alone on the walk home from a late club meeting, standing beneath a street lamp at the edge of the park with the same patient stillness she had shown before. You're more troublesome than I planned for, she said, by way of greeting. Issei stopped several paces away, every instinct honed by years of ambushes telling him this was not a coincidence, and not a conversation he could simply walk past. You said the extraction would fail. It should have. For the first time, something like genuine irritation crossed her expression. I built that failsafe carefully. I expected the fragment to land in her and unravel her control entirely, not simply intensify what she already had the strength to carry. I underestimated how deep her feelings for you actually ran, which is, I'll admit, a rare miscalculation on my part. So this was never really about hurting me at all. He kept his voice level, though his pulse was not. It was always about her. About using me to get to Rias. You give yourself too little credit, and too much at the same time, which is a very human trick. She stepped forward slightly, out of the lamp's direct light, and something about the movement made the shadows around her seem to deepen unnaturally, as though the dark itself was paying closer attention to her than it should. You were never the target, boy. You were the mechanism. The Gremory heir has spent years being courted by every faction with an interest in the underworld's future, and every single one of them has failed to find a lever strong enough to move her. I found one. It simply didn't bend the way I expected it to. Who are you working for? That's a question you're not ready for the answer to. She smiled, thin and unhurried. What you should be more concerned with is that I don't consider tonight's conversation a failure. I consider it a useful correction. I know now that direct manipulation isn't going to work on her, not while you're standing close enough to anchor her against it. So I'll simply have to remove that anchor before I try again. Cold understanding settled into his chest. You're threatening me. I'm informing you. Her tone did not change, which was somehow worse than if it had sharpened into something more obviously hostile. There are considerably older and less patient interests than mine circling this town now that word has gotten out about what happened to the heart glass fragment. A relic that old, activated and then extracted in the same week, leaves ripples. People are going to come looking, some of them far less inclined towards subtlety than I've been. I'd suggest you and your friends prepare for that, rather than assuming the danger ended the night your devil girl stopped glowing. Why tell me this? If you're my enemy, why warn me at all? For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes that looked almost like genuine consideration, as though she were weighing an honest answer against a convenient lie and had not yet decided which to give. Because I don't actually enjoy watching children get caught in the middle of things they don't understand, she said finally, quiet enough that he almost missed it beneath the rustle of wind through the park's trees. I have my own reasons for wanting leverage over the Gremory line, and none of them involve wanting you specifically dead or broken. Consider tonight a professional courtesy, boy. The next person who comes looking for that fragment's ripple effect may not be nearly as inclined to grant you one. She was gone again before he could ask anything further, dissolving into the shadow at the park's edge with the same unhurried certainty she had arrived with, leaving him alone under the street lamp with a warning that felt heavier than any direct threat could have managed. He told Rias everything the moment he reached the clubroom, and watched her expression shift from concern to something colder and more focused as the implications settled into place. If word's out that a relic that old surfaced and was extracted in the same week, she said slowly, then Sona's right that we're not looking at the end of something. We're looking at the opening move. She crossed to the window, staring out at the darkened school grounds with an expression Issei recognized from before every serious fight the club had ever walked into. We need to call everyone together. Sona, Azazel, my brother if it comes to that. If there are older, less patient interests circling Kuoh now, we're not going to face them one crisis at a time and hope we survive each one individually. What are you thinking? Issei asked. Rias turned back to face him, and despite the gravity of what they were both clearly bracing for, there was something steady and unafraid in the way she held his gaze, the same steadiness that had walked directly into the fragment's path without hesitation 8 days earlier. I'm thinking, she said, that whoever's coming next is going to find out very quickly that trying to use you against me was the worst possible strategy they could have chosen. Because now I know exactly what I'm willing to stand in front of, and exactly who I intend to stand in front of it with. Outside, the wind picked up over Kuoh, carrying with it the faint, distant scent of something old and hungry beginning, somewhere beyond the town's borders, to stir. The council Rias called together met in the old schoolhouse 2 nights later, and for the first time since the ordeal began Issei found himself in a room crowded with more supernatural authority than he had ever stood among at once. Sona arrived with Tsubaki and a stack of research that had grown considerably since her first appearance in the clubroom. Azazel came without the usual amusement he wore like armor, his expression serious in a way that made everyone else in the room quietly straighten. And to Issei's considerable surprise, Rias's older brother Surzex appeared as well, stepping through a transportation circle in the corner of the room with the calm, effortless authority of someone who ruled a significant portion of the underworld and had simply chosen, for tonight, to set that authority aside and listen. I received Sona's message this morning, Surzex said, taking a seat near the window rather than the head of the table, a small gesture that Issei suspected was deliberate, a way of signaling that tonight he was here as family rather than as a king. A heart glass fragment surfacing after centuries of dormancy, activated on a member of my sister's peerage, extracted with complications, and now apparently drawing attention from parties old enough that our mystery woman felt compelled to warn you personally. That's not a small matter, Issei. I'd like to hear everything, from the beginning, in your own words. He told the story again, the strange morning that had started it all, the club meeting where Rias first explained what had happened to him, the underground market, Azazel's ritual and its corrupted failsafe, and finally the conversation in the park 2 nights earlier. Surzex listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the particular way Issei had come to associate with people who had learned, over centuries, exactly how much their face could give away if they let it. When Issei finished, Surzex was quiet for a long moment, considering. The heart glass was believed lost during the Great War, he said finally. Not destroyed, simply misplaced somewhere in the chaos of that period. Along with a great many other relics nobody has had the resources to properly track down since. If it's resurfaced now, deliberately, in the hands of someone skilled enough to weaponize it with this much precision, that tells me two things. First, whoever's behind this has resources significant enough to locate and retrieve a relic that's evaded recovery for centuries. Second, they consider my sister a target worth that level of investment, which is not a small statement about how seriously we should be taking this. Do you have any guesses who's actually behind it? Rias asked. The woman in the park wouldn't say who she was working for. Several, Surzex said, none of which I'm comfortable speculating about aloud without more evidence, because the wrong guess spoken in the wrong room can start conflicts we don't currently have the resources to fight. What I can tell you is that the Great War left behind more than misplaced relics. It left behind factions who never fully accepted the current peace, groups who considered the treaties between devils, angels, and fallen angels a temporary inconvenience rather than a lasting settlement. If one of those factions has decided that destabilizing a major devil house is worth the resources required to hunt down a centuries-lost relic, then we're not looking at an isolated incident. We're looking at the opening stages of something considerably larger. Sona leaned forward, her research spread across the table in front of her. I've cross-referenced every recorded appearance of relic activity in this region over the last decade. There's a pattern, faint but consistent, of increased movement along the old ley lines that intersect near Kuoh. Minor incidents, mostly, things that seemed unconnected at the time. A stolen artifact here, an unexplained surge in ambient magic there. Individually, none of it seemed significant enough to escalate. Together, viewed with what we know now, it looks considerably more like groundwork. Groundwork for what? Kiba asked. That, Sona admitted, is the part one haven't been able to determine yet. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Kuoh specifically has become the focal point for this much quiet, sustained interest. This town sits at the intersection of too many old boundaries to be an accidental target. Azazel finally spoke, arms crossed, leaning against the wall near the door. For what it's worth, I agree with Sona's read on this. And I'll add something none of you are going to want to hear. The woman who confronted Issei in the park, the way she talked about removing his anchor to weaken Rias's resistance, that's not the language of a hired mercenary working a single contract. That's the language of someone who studied you specifically, Rias, for a long time, and has been patient enough to wait for the right lever to appear. People don't develop that kind of patience for a quick payday. They develop it because they're playing for something much larger down the line. The room settled into a heavy silence, everyone present absorbing the shape of what was being suggested. Issei glanced at Rias, and found her already watching him, her expression steady but unmistakably troubled beneath the composure she was holding onto for the room's benefit. So what do we do? Issei asked, breaking the quiet. Wait for them to make the next move, or go looking for them first? Neither, entirely, Surzex said, rising from his chair. We prepare. I'll increase the underworld's awareness of activity in this region, and quietly begin tracing the heart glass's recent ownership history, which may tell us more about who retrieved it, and why. Sona, continue your research into the ley line activity. Azazel, I'd like your assessment of what other relics from that same lost period might still be out there, in case this is the first of several pieces being gathered rather than an isolated retrieval. He paused at the door, looking back at his sister with an expression that briefly softened past the careful neutrality of the rest of the meeting. And Rias, I want you and your peerage to stay close together for the foreseeable future. Whatever's circling this town, I'd rather it find you surrounded by people willing to stand in front of you than isolated and vulnerable. I don't intend to be isolated, Rias said, and something in the way she said it, brief and certain, made Issei's chest tighten with a feeling that had nothing to do with any relic at all. Surzex left the way he had arrived, the transportation circle folding shut behind him, and the room exhaled collectively, the tension of the meeting settling into something more like grim resolve. Sona gathered her papers. Azazel pushed off the wall with a tired sigh and muttered something about relic archives he was going to need to dig through before morning. One by one the room emptied, until only Issei and Rias remained, standing together near the window where the last of the evening light was fading into full dark over Kuoh. "This is bigger than I thought it was," Issei admitted quietly. "When it started, I thought we were just trying to survive a curse. Now it sounds like we're standing in front of something a lot older than either of us. Maybe." Rias slipped her hand into his, the same steady grip she had offered him from the very beginning. "But you didn't run from a curse you didn't understand, Issei. I don't think either of us is going to run from whatever this turns out to be either. Whatever's coming for Kuoh, it's going to have to come through all of us first." Sona's research turned up something concrete 4 days later, arriving at the clubroom with a folder thick enough that Tsubaki had to carry a second one behind her. She spread the contents across the table without preamble, the careful excitement of someone who had found a thread worth pulling barely contained beneath her usual composure. "The ley line surges I mentioned aren't random," she said. "I mapped every recorded incident over the last 3 years against known relic auction activity in the black markets across 3 territories, and there's a pattern that's too consistent to be coincidence. Someone has been methodically acquiring artifacts tied to a specific historical period. Not just the heart glass. At least 6 other pieces, all originating from the same lost cache that vanished during the final years of the Great War." Azazel leaned over the table, scanning the pages with a frown deepening by the second. "I know some of these names. This one," he tapped a page near the center of the spread, "the War Breaker chain, that's not a minor relic. That's something that was specifically designed to unmake territorial boundaries. If someone's collected that alongside the heart glass, they're not building a curiosity cabinet. They're assembling a set." "A set for what purpose?" Rias asked. "That's the part that worries me most," Sona admitted. "Every relic in this pattern was originally catalogued as part of the same lost arsenal, pieces built to work in concert rather than individually. The historical records are fragmentary, most of the direct knowledge lost when the cache itself disappeared, but the surviving accounts suggest the full set was designed for a single, specific purpose. Breaking the seals that have kept several older, dangerous entities bound since the end of the war." The room went very still. "You're saying someone's trying to free something that was sealed away on purpose," Kiba said slowly. "I'm saying the pattern is consistent with that theory," Sona corrected, careful as always to distinguish confirmed fact from informed suspicion. "I don't have proof of intent yet, only proof of acquisition. But if I'm right, then the heart glass being used on Issei wasn't simply about destabilizing the Gremory house for its own sake. It may have been a test, a way of confirming this town's defenses and resources before committing further, or it may have been a necessary step toward acquiring something else entirely, something that required Rias compromised or distracted at a specific moment." Azazel straightened, expression grim. "If that's true, we need to know what's actually sealed in this region. Every territory keeps records of what's bound within its borders, even if most of that information stays deliberately buried to keep exactly this kind of scheme from ever getting off the ground." "I already reached out to Surzex," Sona said. "He's pulling the relevant archives now, but some of those records predate even his authority to access without additional clearance. It may take time." "Time we may not have much of," Rias murmured, staring down at the spread of pages with an intensity that reminded Issei, not for the first time, exactly how seriously she took the weight of her family's responsibilities. Issei studied the map Sona had assembled, lines connecting incident after incident across the region, all of them converging, however loosely, toward Kuoh itself. "If they're building towards something that requires this specific town," he said slowly, "then whatever sealed here has to be significant. Not just any old binding. Something big enough to be worth years of patient collection." "That's my read as well," Sona agreed. "Which is precisely why I don't think our mystery woman was lying when she warned you that others were coming. If this operation has been running for years, it's almost certainly not the work of a single actor. Whoever's assembling this set likely has allies, resources, and contingencies we haven't even begun to map yet." Aquino, who had been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke from where she stood near the window. Then perhaps it's time we stopped reacting to each move as it comes and started building contingencies of our own. If they're patient enough to spend years on this, we should be patient enough to prepare properly rather than scrambling every time they surface. Agreed, Rias said, some of the weight in her expression settling into resolve rather than worry. Sona, keep working the research. Azazel, I want your honest assessment of what we'd be facing if even one of these sealed entities got loose, so we know exactly what we're trying to prevent. Kiba, Kaneko, I want increased patrols around the town's boundary, especially near any location with a history of unusual ley line activity. And me? Issei asked. Rias's gaze softened slightly as it settled on him, though the resolve underneath it did not waver. You stay close, and you stay ready. Whatever this turns out to be, I have a feeling it's not finished using you as a lever if it thinks that's still an option. I'd rather have you where I can see you than find out the hard way that they've found another angle to work. The meeting broke apart gradually, everyone dispersing to their assigned tasks with the particular quiet focus of people who understood, without needing it said aloud, that the stakes had just shifted considerably beyond anything a single relic curse could account for. Issei lingered near the window with Rias after the others had gone, watching the last of the daylight fade over a town that suddenly felt smaller and more fragile than it had a week earlier, sitting as it apparently did atop something old and dangerous enough to be worth years of patient scheming to unearth. Are you frightened? He asked her quietly. A little, she admitted, which surprised him, given how rarely she allowed herself that kind of honesty in front of anyone. Not for myself, mostly. For everyone who'd be standing beside me if this turns into the kind of fight Sona's research suggests it might. I've spent my whole life training for battles against rivals I could see coming. I don't know yet what it looks like to fight something that's been sealed away since before either of us was born. Then we'll figure it out together, Issei said. The same way we've figured out everything else so far. Rias leaned into him, some of the day's tension finally easing out of her shoulders, and for a while neither of them said anything else, content simply to stand together at the window and watch the dark settle fully over Kuoh, aware that somewhere beneath its familiar streets, an old and patient danger was continuing to gather itself, one careful piece at a time. The patrols Rias ordered turned up nothing for the better part of a week, which did more to fray everyone's nerves than an actual confrontation might have. Kaneko reported faint traces of old magic near the shrine on the town's eastern edge, residue too degraded to identify clearly, and Kiba found a section of the western woods where the local wildlife had gone conspicuously silent, the kind of quiet that usually meant something had passed through recently, and left the animals unwilling to test whether it was still nearby. Neither discovery amounted to a lead. Both amounted to confirmation that something was, in fact, moving carefully around the edges of the town, patient enough to avoid every attempt to catch it directly. Issei spent the week doing exactly what Rias had asked, staying close, staying ready, and increasingly restless with the feeling of waiting for a blow he could not see coming. It was Asia who eventually noticed the toll it was taking on him, finding him alone in the clubroom late one afternoon, staring out the window with the particular stillness of someone whose thoughts had wandered somewhere unpleasant. You've been quiet, she said, settling into the seat across from him. Just thinking. He managed a small smile for her benefit, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Everyone's out looking for something we can't find, and I'm just supposed to sit here and stay safe. I don't know how to do that well. I never have. I know. Asia's expression was gentle but knowing, the particular understanding of someone who had watched him rush headlong into danger more times than either of them could easily count. But I don't think Rias asked you to stay close because she thinks you're weak, Issei. I think she asked because she's frightened of what happens if you're not there, and she doesn't know how else to ask for that without it sounding like she doesn't trust you to take care of yourself. He turned that over for a moment, some of the restlessness in his chest easing slightly at the reframing. I hadn't thought about it that way. You rarely do, when it comes to the people who care about you. Asia said it without judgment, simply an observation offered with the same quiet honesty she brought to everything. You spend so much energy worrying about protecting everyone else that I don't think you always notice how much everyone else worries about protecting you in return. It isn't a weakness to let them. It's just fair. He was still considering that when the window beside them shattered inward. Issei was on his feet before the glass finished falling, pulling Issei behind him on instinct, and found himself facing a figure crouched in the broken frame that he did not recognize, tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered cloth that seemed to absorb the afternoon light rather than reflect it. It moved with a wrongness that set every alarm in his body ringing at once, joints bending at angles that did not belong to anything human, or even properly devil. Boosted gear, it said, voice like stone grinding against stone. Confirmed presence. Extraction sequence beginning. Issei, get Rias, Issei snapped, already summoning the crimson gauntlet to his left arm, the familiar weight of it settling over his forearm with a comforting hum. Issei bolted for the door as the creature lunged, faster than its awkward posture suggested it should be capable of, and Issei barely managed to get his arm up in time to block the strike, the impact rattling up through his shoulder hard enough to numb it briefly. He drove a counter into the creature's midsection, felt it connect with something that gave slightly beneath the blow, and used the half-second of stagger to put the overturned table between them. Extraction sequence, it repeated, unbothered by the hit, straightening back to its full unnatural height. Sacred gear resonance confirmed. Compatible with collection requirements. They're not just after Rias, Issei realized aloud, cold understanding settling into him even as he kept the creature's advance at bay. They're after this too. The boosted gear. The door burst open before the creature could close the distance again, Rias arriving with Aquino at her shoulder, both already summoning power, and the creature's attention split for the half-second it took to register the new threats, which was exactly long enough for Aquino to drive a bolt of lightning through the space where it had been standing a moment before, forcing it to scramble sideways with a shriek that sounded more mechanical than living. "What is that thing?" Rias demanded, circling to put herself between the creature and Issei with the same fierce, immediate protectiveness she had shown from the very beginning of all of this. "I don't know," Issei admitted, "but it wants my sacred gear specifically." It called it a collection requirement. Rias's expression hardened into something Issei recognized from every serious fight the club had walked into together. "Then it's not getting anywhere near it." She raised a hand, crimson power gathering at her fingertips with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavier. "Whatever set this thing loose, tell it that if it wants to test how far it can push us, this is a very poor place to start." The creature's attention snapped fully toward her, some flicker of calculation passing behind whatever passed for its eyes, and for a moment Issei thought it might actually retreat, weighing the odds against 3 devils and a sacred gear wielder all bracing to fight it at once. Instead it lunged directly at Rias, ignoring Issei entirely, and he understood, in the half-second before it closed the distance, that whoever had sent it had given it very specific priorities, and that protecting the Gremory heir had just become considerably more urgent than protecting himself. He moved without thinking, closing the gap between them and driving his gauntlet fist into the creature's flank hard enough to send it crashing sideways through the remains of the shattered window, out into the courtyard below, buying Rias the half-second of distance the impact created. "Issei." Rias's voice carried real fear for the first time since this had all begun, watching him follow the creature's fall without hesitation. "I've got this," he called back, already moving toward the broken window, the crimson gauntlet pulsing with gathering power along his arm. "It wants the boosted gear." "Fine. Let's see how badly." Below, in the courtyard, the creature was already rising back to its full unnatural height, tattered cloth rippling in a wind that did not match the stillness of the afternoon around it, and somewhere beyond the school's boundary, Issei was certain, whoever had sent it was watching closely to see exactly how this confrontation was going to end. Issei dropped from the shattered window into the courtyard, landing in a crouch as the creature turned to meet him, its awkward joints unfolding into a fighting stance that looked wrong in a dozen small ways, as though whatever built it had studied combat from a distance rather than learning it directly. He did not wait for it to close the gap. He drove forward first, gauntlet gathering a fresh pulse of power that surged hot up his arm. "Boost," the familiar voice inside the gauntlet intoned, and he felt the strength in his limbs double, the ground blurring slightly beneath his feet as he closed the distance faster than the creature seemed to anticipate. His fist connected with its chest hard enough to crack whatever passed for its ribs, and it staggered back with a shriek of grinding stone, tattered cloth whipping around it as it fought to keep its footing. It recovered faster than a normal opponent should have, lashing out with a clawed hand that raked across his shoulder before he could fully pull back, tearing through fabric and skin both, a line of fire opening along his arm that he gritted his teeth through rather than acknowledge. Above him, Rias appeared at the broken window, hands already raised, but he shook his head sharply before she could commit to a casting. "Stay back," he called up. "If it's after the boosted gear specifically, I don't want it deciding you're a better target the moment it realizes I'm not going down easily." "Issei, I've got this," he said again, and this time there was enough certainty in his voice that she held herself back, though every line of her posture in the window said the restraint cost her considerably. The creature lunged again, faster now, clearly having recalibrated whatever passed for its strategy after the first exchange, and Issei met it with a defensive stance this time, letting the boosted strength in his limbs absorb the impact rather than trying to overpower it directly. It grabbed for his gauntlet arm with both hands, joints bending unnaturally as it tried to wrench the sacred gear itself loose through sheer force, and for a terrifying half-second he felt something pulling at the gauntlet's edges that had nothing to do with physical strength at all, a cold, invasive pressure trying to work its way beneath the armor and into the bond between the gear and its wielder. "Boost," the voice inside the gauntlet said again, sharper this time, almost urgent, and Issei felt the surge answer something in him that was not just physical strength, a stubborn refusal rising up from somewhere deep and old inside him that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the simple fact that he was not going to let this thing take from him the one part of himself that had always, from the very beginning, been entirely and unquestionably his own. He drove his free hand into the creature's grip, forcing enough separation to plant his boot against its midsection, and kicked with everything the boost had given him. The impact sent it flying backward across the courtyard, crashing through the low stone wall bordering the garden beds, and this time it did not immediately rise. Issei advanced on it anyway, unwilling to give it the chance to recover, and found it slumped against the wreckage of the wall with cracks spreading visibly through its stone-gray hide, the tattered cloth around it losing whatever animating force had kept it moving so unnaturally moments before. "Extraction sequence," it said, voice fracturing along with its body, failed. "Reporting failure. Reporting failure." "Who sent you?" Issei demanded, gauntlet still raised, breathing hard from the exertion of the fight. "Who's collecting these relics?" The creature's cracked head tilted toward him, something almost curious in the gesture despite the damage. "Collection continues regardless of individual failure. The set does not require completion by any single method." Its voice was fading now, the cracks spreading faster, light beginning to leak from the fractures like something inside it was finally escaping containment. "You will not be the last extraction attempted, Dragon Boy. There are others already positioned. Others already patient." "What set?" Issei pressed, closing the distance despite the visible instability radiating off the creature's crumbling form. "What are you collecting pieces for?" It did not answer, or perhaps it simply ran out of whatever time it had left to answer, because the light leaking from its cracks flared bright all at once and then went out entirely, the creature collapsing into a scatter of gray ash and broken stone that dissolved into nothing before it even settled fully to the ground. Issei stood over the remains for a long moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline of the fight slowly draining out of him and leaving behind a colder, more unsettled understanding of exactly how large this was becoming. Rias reached him a moment later, having abandoned the window in favor of the stairs the instant the fight ended, and the fierce relief on her face as she reached him did nothing to soften the grim shape of what the creature's last words had confirmed. "There are others already positioned," she repeated, having clearly heard enough from the window to catch the important part. It wasn't lying. Whoever's behind this isn't relying on a single method or a single agent. "No," Issei agreed, letting the gauntlet fade from his arm now that the immediate danger had passed, the wound on his shoulder throbbing sharply now that the boosted adrenaline was ebbing away. "And it wasn't just after you this time. It was after the boosted gear specifically. Whatever set they're assembling, I think I'm part of the collection too, not just useful leverage against you." Rias's expression tightened with a fear that had nothing to do with herself, and everything to do with the sudden, sharp realization that the danger circling them had just widened to include him directly, not as a means to an end but as a target in his own right. "Then we're not just defending Kuoh anymore," she said quietly, pulling him into a fierce, careful embrace that mindful of his injured shoulder but no less desperate for the care. "We're defending both of us. And whatever's coming next, I'm not letting it get anywhere near either half of that equation. Behind them, Aquino and Asia arrived through the shattered window with the rest of the peerage close behind, and the courtyard filled quickly with the low, urgent murmur of a group already beginning to reorganize around a threat that had just proven itself considerably more serious, and considerably more personal, than any of them had allowed themselves to fully prepare for. Azazel arrived within the hour, summoned by an urgent message from Sona the moment word of the attack reached her, and spent a long while examining the scattered ash and broken stone in the courtyard with the same focused intensity he had brought to the extraction ritual days earlier. When he finally straightened, his expression had lost whatever remained of its usual dry humor entirely. This wasn't a stray devil, or anything remotely natural, he said, crouching to examine a fragment of the creature's stone hide that had somehow survived its collapse. This was constructed, built specifically for a single purpose and given just enough autonomy to identify and pursue that purpose without needing direct oversight the entire time. That's old craft, older than most of the artificing techniques currently practiced anywhere in the underworld or among the fallen. Can you tell who built it? Sona asked, kneeling beside him to examine the fragment herself. Not from this alone. But I can tell you it required significant resources and even more significant knowledge, the kind that isn't casually available even among people who study relics for a living. Azazel rose, brushing ash from his hands with a grimace. Whoever's behind this operation isn't a single ambitious opportunist working alone. This has the fingerprints of an organization, one old enough and resourced enough to build constructs from techniques most of the current world has forgotten even existed. Rias, standing close beside Issei with her arms still faintly trembling from the adrenaline of the fight, absorbed this without visible surprise, as though some part of her had already suspected the scale of what they were facing before Azazel confirmed it aloud. The woman in the park told Issei that others were coming. Less patient than she'd been. I think we just met one example of what she meant. If that's the case, Sona said, straightening with her usual clinical calm settling back over her expression despite the circumstances, then we need to treat this as an active, ongoing threat rather than an isolated incident to investigate at our own pace. I'll expand the research into a full working theory by tomorrow. Azazel, I'd like your help identifying what other constructs from this same craft tradition might exist, so we know roughly what to expect if this happens again. Already planning on it, Azazel said grimly. Though I'll be honest with all of you, this is bigger than a favor for an old ally's little sister anymore. If someone's resurrecting artificing techniques this old to hunt down both a sacred gear and a devil heir at once, I think it's time I stopped pretending I'm retired and started treating this the way I'd treat any other serious threat to the region's stability. Issei listened to the exchange with his shoulder freshly bandaged by Asia's careful healing, the ache of the wound a steady, grounding reminder that whatever had just happened had been real and close and nearly costly in ways that went beyond the metaphorical danger they had been discussing in careful strategy meetings over the past week. The creature's final words echoed in his mind, patient, deliberate, entirely unbothered by its own failure. There are others already positioned. Others already patient. What happens now, he asked, when the immediate flurry of assessment and planning finally slowed enough for the question to fit? Rias turned to face him fully, and despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the fear still visible at the edges of her composure, there was something steady and resolved in the way she met his eyes. Now we stop treating this like a single crisis to survive and start treating it like a war we need to prepare for properly, she said. I'm going to ask my brother to formally involve the underworld's defense apparatus, not just his personal attention. Sona and Azazel are going to keep pulling every thread of research they can find. And you, her hand found his uninjured shoulder, gentle but firm, are going to stop thinking of yourself as leverage in someone else's plan and start thinking of yourself as exactly what that creature called you. A target worth protecting in your own right, not just because of what you mean to me, but because of what you are. I've never been good at that kind of thinking, Issei admitted. I know. Her smile was small but genuine, threading warmth through the gravity of the moment. So we'll work on it together. The same way we've worked on everything else since this began. Around them, the courtyard slowly emptied as the immediate crisis response wound down, Sona and Azazel departing to begin the research that would occupy them for the days ahead, Kiba and Kaneko securing the school's perimeter against any further intrusion, Akino and Asia tending to the last of the minor damage the fight had left scattered across the grounds. Issei stood with Rias amid the settling quiet, the broken window above them a stark reminder of how quickly the fragile peace of the past week had shattered, and found himself thinking, not for the first time since this had all begun, that whatever waited for them beyond the borders of what they currently understood, they would face it the way they had faced everything so far, together, deliberately, and with a clarity about what they were fighting for that no relic, however old or however cleverly wielded, could ever hope to fully account for or unravel. Far beyond Kuoh's boundaries, in places Issei could not yet see and would not understand the shape of for some time to come, the patient architects of a collection years in the making took quiet note of another failure, and began, without hesitation or apparent concern, to prepare the next piece of a plan that had never depended on any single attempt succeeding to eventually, inevitably, reach its intended end. Surzek's returned to the schoolhouse the following evening, this time without the careful, family-first softness he had shown at the earlier council, and the shift in his bearing told Issei everything he needed to know before a single word had been spoken. This was the king of the underworld standing in the room now, not simply a concerned older brother. "I've reviewed everything Sona sent me," he said, once the peerage had gathered again around the same crowded table. "The construct's design, the pattern of relic acquisitions, the ley line surges. I also received word this morning of 2 similar incidents in neighboring territories, both involving old artificing techniques we believed lost, both targeting individuals connected to significant bloodlines or sacred gear resonance." He let that settle over the room before continuing. "This isn't isolated to Kuoh. It never was. Kuoh simply happens to be where the pattern converges most visibly, which likely means it's where whoever is behind this intends to finish whatever they've been quietly building toward." "Do we know what that is yet?" Rias asked. "Not with certainty. But I've authorized a full defensive posture for this territory, effective immediately. Additional patrol units, expanded surveillance along the ley lines Sona identified, and direct communication channels between our forces and the angelic and fallen factions who share an interest in preventing whatever old binding this is ultimately aimed at unraveling." Surzek's gaze moved around the table, settling briefly on each of them in turn, weighing, assessing, before returning to rest on his sister. "I won't pretend this isn't serious, Rias. But I also won't pretend any of you are facing it unsupported. Whatever comes next, you have more behind you than a single peerage's resources." Some of the tension in the room eased slightly at that, though not entirely. The weight of everything Sona's research had uncovered still settled heavily over every face at the table. Issei found himself, in the quiet that followed, reaching for Rias's hand beneath the table without entirely deciding to, and found her fingers already reaching for his in return, the same steady anchor they had offered each other since the very first strange morning that had started all of this. "Then we're ready," Rias said to the room, to her brother, to herself as much as anyone. "Whatever they're building toward, whatever old thing they think they're going to unearth here, they're going to find out that this town isn't undefended, and neither are the people they've decided to target." Surzek allowed himself the smallest, proudest smile before the transportation circle folded him away again, and the room settled into the steady, purposeful quiet of people preparing for a fight they now understood was coming, rather than one they were merely bracing to survive. Outside, the last light of evening faded fully into night over Kuoh, and somewhere beneath its quiet, familiar streets, the old, patient danger that had been circling them from the very beginning continued, unhurried and unbothered, to gather itself toward whatever it had always intended to become. Later that night, after the schoolhouse had emptied and the patrol rotations had settled into their new, more vigilant rhythm, Issei found Rias alone on the rooftop, looking out over the darkened town with an expression more contemplative than the fierce resolve she had worn through the evening's council. "Couldn't sleep," he said, settling beside her at the railing. "Too much to think about." She did not look away from the skyline, though her hand found his without hesitation, the gesture familiar now in a way that no longer needed the shadow of any relic to explain it. "A week ago I thought the hardest thing I'd have to face was untangling what was real and what the heart glass amplified in me. Now I'm looking out at my own town wondering how much of it is sitting on top of something I don't understand yet, and whether I'll be strong enough to protect it when that thing finally decides to wake up. You won't be facing it alone, Issei said. None of us will be. I know. She finally turned to look at him, and the ghost of a smile touched her expression despite the weight of everything else. That's the part that actually makes me believe we can win this, whatever it turns out to be. Not because I'm certain of our strength. Because I'm certain of who's standing beside me while we find out. Below them, Kuoh settled into its ordinary nighttime quiet, streetlights glowing steady over empty roads, entirely unaware of how much had shifted beneath its surface in the space of a single strange week. Issei stood with Rias at the railing for a long while, saying nothing further, simply letting the closeness speak for itself, and thought, watching the town breathe its slow, unknowing rhythm below them, that whatever waited in the deeper dark ahead, they would meet it together, exactly as they had promised. Somewhere below, a light flicked on in the clubroom window, Sona's silhouette briefly visible as she settled in for another long night of research, unwilling to let the day's discoveries wait until morning. Akino's quiet laughter drifted faintly up from somewhere near the courtyard, Asia's voice answering it a moment later, the ordinary sounds of a peerage still finding small moments of warmth, even under the shadow of everything Sona's maps had suggested was coming. Issei listened to it all settle around him, the fragile, ordinary music of people who had chosen, deliberately and without illusion about the danger ahead, to stay close to each other anyway, and felt, for the first time since the strange morning that had started all of this, something that was not quite peace but stood close enough beside it to matter. Whatever it is, he said quietly, we'll be ready for it. We will, Rias agreed, and for once neither of them needed to say anything further, the certainty of it settling comfortably between them as the last of the night deepened over Kuoh. Sona's breakthrough came at dawn. After a night spent buried in archives, Surzex had finally cleared her to access, and she arrived at the schoolhouse looking as though she had not slept at all, eyes bright with the particular exhaustion of someone who had found exactly what she had been searching for and was still absorbing the weight of it. I know what's sealed beneath Kuoh, she said before anyone had fully settled into their seats. The room went still. It's called the Ashen Sovereign in the surviving records, though the name itself is a translation of something considerably older, a designation rather than a true name. It was one of the last entities bound during the closing days of the Great War, powerful enough that no single faction could destroy it outright, so the three great powers combined their strength to seal it instead, choosing this location specifically because the ley lines converging here provided the strongest possible anchor for a binding meant to last indefinitely. Sona spread a hand-drawn diagram across the table, old symbols traced carefully around a central point that Issei recognized, with a chill, as roughly the same location the earlier ley line map had circled. The seal was designed with 7 anchor points, each one keyed to a specific category of relic. The heart glass was one. The ward breaker chain Azazel identified was another. Whoever's been assembling this collection isn't gathering curiosities. They're gathering keys. How many keys have they collected so far? Rias asked, voice tight. Based on the acquisition pattern I've traced, at least 4 of the 7, possibly 5. Which means, Sona did not soften the delivery, they may be considerably closer to completing the set than any of us wanted to believe. Azazel, arriving mid-explanation with the particular grim urgency of a man who had spent the night chasing the same thread from a different angle, dropped into the nearest chair without ceremony. I can confirm the entity's nature, for what it's worth, though I wish I couldn't. The Ashen Sovereign wasn't sealed because it was simply dangerous. It was sealed because it was a mistake, something created rather than born, an experiment from the war's final desperate years that got away from whoever built it, and had to be contained before it finished whatever it had been in the process of doing when the sealing occurred. What was it doing? Issei asked. The records are incomplete, deliberately so I suspect, but the fragments that survive suggest it was consuming something. Not lives exactly, not in the straightforward sense. Something closer to potential, possibility, the capacity of a place or a people to become something more than they currently were. It moved through territory like a slow fire through dry grass, and everywhere it passed, the survivors described the land afterward as diminished somehow, smaller, as though a portion of what it might have become had simply been taken. The room absorbed that in heavy silence. Issei thought of Kuoh, ordinary and familiar, students walking to school every morning without any awareness of what slept beneath their feet, and felt something cold settle low in his stomach. If it's released, Rias said slowly, it wouldn't just threaten this town. It would threaten everything the town might have ever become. Every life here, every future any of us might have built. That's my read as well, Azazel agreed. And I don't think whoever's collecting these keys intends to simply release it and walk away. An entity like that, properly directed rather than left to consume indiscriminately, would be an almost unimaginable weapon. If someone's patient and skilled enough to gather 5 of 7 keys without triggering a full-scale response from any of the great powers, I have to assume they're patient and skilled enough to have a plan for controlling what they release, not just unleashing it blindly. Do we know who? Kiba asked, the question that had been hanging over every meeting since the courtyard attack. Sona hesitated, which was unusual enough for her that everyone's attention sharpened immediately. I have a theory, though I want to stress it's not confirmed. The scale of resources required, the depth of historical knowledge, the patience spanning years rather than months. There's only a small handful of organizations old enough and resourced enough to fit that profile. My strongest candidate is a remnant faction from the Great War itself, one that officially disbanded when the treaties were signed but that intelligence has suspected, for decades, never actually stopped operating. They called themselves the Ashbourne Circle, and if the name's connection to the entity beneath us isn't coincidental, I think we may have just found our answer. The Ashbourne Circle, Rias repeated, something flickering behind her eyes that looked like recognition. My mother mentioned them once, years ago. A cautionary story more than a current threat, from what I understood at the time. Devils and fallen and even a handful of exiled angels, united by nothing except the belief that the current peace was a weakness rather than a strength, and that true power required embracing exactly the kind of chaos the war had nearly destroyed everyone trying to contain. If they've spent this long patiently working toward releasing something that consumes a place's future, Azazel said grimly, then chaos isn't just a philosophy for them. It's the entire plan. Issei looked around the table, at the weight settling over every face present, and felt the shape of what they were actually facing crystallize into something far larger than a curse or even a targeted attack. This was not a fight they could win by simply outlasting a countdown or defeating a single opponent in a courtyard. This was a fight against something patient, ideological, and years in the making, aimed at unmaking the very future of the town all of them called home. Then we stop them before they finish gathering the last keys, he said. Whatever it takes. Rias's hand found his beneath the table, the same steady anchor it had always been, and this time when she spoke, there was no uncertainty left in her voice at all, only the hard, clear resolve of someone who had just understood exactly what she was going to spend whatever came next fighting to protect. Whatever it takes, she agreed. Starting with finding out exactly which 2 keys they're still missing, and making absolutely certain they never get their hands on either one. The 2 missing keys, Sona determined over the following 2 days of frantic cross-referencing, were a mirror called the Second Dawn, last recorded in the possession of a minor angelic archive somewhere in the Northern Territories, and something the old records referred to only as the Widow's Coin, its current location entirely unknown, its last confirmed sighting nearly a century in the past. If the Ashbourne Circle already has the coin, Sona said, laying out the summary for the assembled council, then the mirror is the last piece standing between them and a complete set. Which means it's also the piece they're most likely to move on next, and the piece we have the best chance of reaching first, since at least we know roughly where it currently sits. Then we go get it before they do, Kiba said. It's not that simple. Azazel leaned over the map Sona had spread across the table, tracing the Northern Territories border with a frown. That archive belongs to the angelic faction. We can't simply walk in and request a centuries-old relic on the strength of a theory, however solid Sona's research is. We're going to need Michael's cooperation, or at minimum the cooperation of someone with enough standing in that faction to grant access without a diplomatic incident. I can reach out, Rias said. My family has standing with the angelic faction through the treaty channels. It won't be instant, but it should be faster than trying to work around them. Do it, Sirzek said, having arrived partway through the discussion and settled into listening with the same grave attention he had brought to every council since the threat's true scale became clear. I'll add my own request through official channels as well. 2 appeals from the Gremory House carry more weight than 1, and if the Ashbourne Circle really is close to completing their collection, we don't have the luxury of a slow diplomatic process. The request went out that evening, and the reply came back faster than any of them expected, not from Michael directly but from an intermediary who identified herself only as a caretaker of the Northern Archive, informing them that the mirror had, in fact, already been requested for removal 3 days earlier by a party claiming legitimate diplomatic authority, and that the caretaker had granted the request in good faith before any warning about the Ashbourne Circle's activities had reached the angelic faction's attention. They already have it, Rias said, reading the reply aloud with a flatness that did nothing to hide how badly the news had landed. They already have all 7. The room went silent in a way that felt different from every previous silence the past weeks had produced, heavier, closer to dread than simple concern. If they have the full set, Azazel said slowly, then we're not looking at a countdown measured in weeks anymore. We're looking at one measured in days, possibly less, depending on how quickly they can complete whatever ritual the 7 keys require to unmake the binding. Sona was already pulling her research back open, flipping through pages with visibly shaking hands, an unusual break in her composure that underscored exactly how serious the situation had become. The old records mention a ritual window tied to the same ley line convergence that anchors the seal itself. If I'm reading this correctly, there's a period roughly 3 days from now when the convergence reaches its peak alignment, the ideal conditions for either reinforcing the binding or breaking it entirely. If the Ashbourne Circle has been planning around this timeline, that's almost certainly the date they're building toward. 3 days, Issei repeated, the number settling into his chest with the same cold weight it had carried the first time a countdown like this had been placed on him. 3 days, Sirzex confirmed grimly, rising from his seat with the decisive energy of a king who had just watched a slow-moving threat become an immediate one. Which means we stop planning for a defensive posture and start planning for a direct confrontation. I'll bring every asset I can justify moving into this territory without triggering a full diplomatic crisis with the other factions. Azazel, I need everything you know about how a binding this old might be broken, so we know exactly what to watch for and, if it comes to it, how to stop the ritual mid-completion. And if we can't stop it in time, Kiba asked quietly, if it does complete? Sirzex did not offer false comfort. Then we fight whatever comes out of that seal directly, with everything this territory and every ally I can call on in 3 days brings to the field. That's the plan behind the plan, and I'd rather all of you understand it clearly now than discover it unprepared in the moment we actually need it. Rias's grip on Issei's hand tightened, and when he looked at her, he found none of the fear that had colored her expression in quieter, more private moments over the past weeks. What looked back at him instead was the same fierce, unflinching resolve she had shown from the very beginning, sharpened now into something with an edge. 3 days, she said, echoing the number back to the room like a challenge rather than a countdown. Then we make every hour of it count. Because whatever the Ashbourne Circle thinks they're about to unleash on this town, they're going to find out that we didn't spend the last few weeks simply waiting to be a victim of it. Outside the schoolhouse windows, the sky over Kuoh had gone the deep violet of early evening, 3 days from whatever reckoning was quietly, patiently, and finally arriving. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation more intense than anything Issei had experienced since first joining Rias's peerage. The schoolhouse transformed into something closer to a command center than a clubroom, maps and duty rosters and defensive formations covering every available surface. Sirzex made good on his promise, quietly funneling additional forces into the territory under cover of routine diplomatic rotation, careful not to alarm the other factions while still ensuring Kuoh would not stand undefended when the ley line convergence reached its peak. Issei spent the days training harder than he had in months, pushing the boosted gear through drills alongside Kiba and Kaneko, sparring until his muscles ached and the gauntlet's familiar hum felt less like a weapon and more like an extension of his own resolve. Rias drilled her peerage's coordination relentlessly, running formation after formation until every member could anticipate the other's movements without needing to speak, and in the rare quiet moments between sessions, she and Issei found themselves simply sitting together, saying little, drawing whatever steadiness they could from each other's presence before whatever came next arrived to test it. On the evening before the convergence, Azazel gathered the full assembled group for a final briefing, his expression grave in a way that made even his usual dry humor entirely absent. "I've done everything I can to understand what we're about to face," he said, spreading a final set of notes across the table. "The binding sits at the old shrine on the eastern edge of town, the same location Kaneko flagged weeks ago when she first sensed residual magic there. If the Ashbourne Circle intends to complete their ritual, that's almost certainly where it happens, and I'd expect them to move under cover of darkness, likely in the hours immediately preceding the convergence's peak." "What are we facing when we get there?" Rias asked. "Beyond the Circle's own forces, which I'd estimate at a dozen skilled operatives at minimum given the scale of resources they've already demonstrated, there's the ritual itself to consider. If it's mid-completion when we arrive, disrupting it carries its own risk. Bindings this old don't simply switch off cleanly when interrupted. There's a real possibility that a partial disruption could destabilize the seal in ways almost as dangerous as letting the ritual finish uncontested." Azazel's gaze moved around the room, settling briefly on each face. "I won't lie to any of you. This is not a fight with a clean, guaranteed path to victory. But it's a fight we have to take, because the alternative is standing back and letting them finish uncontested, and none of us are willing to accept that outcome." "Then we go in with everything," Sirzek said, having joined the briefing personally rather than through message this time, his own forces already positioned quietly around the town's perimeter. "I'll take the outer approach with my personal guard, cutting off any reinforcement or retreat route the Circle might have planned. Rias, I want your peerage leading the direct approach to the shrine itself, since you know this town's terrain better than any outside force I could bring in on short notice." "Understood," Rias said, and there was no hesitation in her voice at all, only the steady certainty of someone who had spent the last 3 days preparing precisely for this moment. The briefing wound down as night fell fully over the town, everyone dispersing to final preparations, and Issei found himself once more on the schoolhouse rooftop with Rias, the same spot where they had stood together weeks earlier processing the scale of what Sona's research had first uncovered. The town below looked exactly as it always had, streetlights glowing over quiet roads, entirely unaware that its future was about to be decided in the hours ahead. "Are you ready?" Rias asked quietly. "No," Issei admitted, honest in a way he had learned, over these strange weeks, was always better between them than false confidence. "But I'm not going to let that stop me." "Good." She leaned into him, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, simply drawing whatever strength they could from the closeness before the night ahead demanded everything either of them had to give. "Whatever happens at that shrine, Issei, I need you to remember something for me." "What's that?" "That none of this, whatever the Circle intended when they first set the heart glass on you, none of what's between us now is something they gave us. It's something we built, in spite of them, out of exactly the kind of ordinary, stubborn care that things like the Ashbourne Circle will never understand and will never be able to take away, no matter what they manage to unleash tomorrow night." Her hand found his, steady as it had always been since the very beginning. "Whatever we're about to walk into, we walk into it as exactly what we chose to become. Not what a relic made us." Issei held her gaze, and felt something settle inside him that was steadier than any boost the sacred gear could offer, a certainty rooted in weeks of choices made freely, deliberately, together. "Then let's go finish this," he said. "On our own terms." Below them, the town held its last quiet hour before the convergence began, and somewhere beyond its familiar streets, at an old shrine on the eastern edge of everything they had spent these weeks fighting to protect, the Ashbourne Circle was already moving into position. The eastern shrine looked different at night than Issei remembered it from the few times he had passed it in daylight, its weathered stone steps and modest torii gate transformed under the convergence's building energy into something that seemed to pulse faintly with its own inner light, the air around it thick with a pressure that made his ears ring the closer their group drew to it. Rias raised a fist, halting the advance at the tree-line, and through the gaps in the foliage Issei could see the shrine's courtyard already occupied, a dozen or more robed figures arranged in a precise formation around a central circle inscribed with symbols that pulsed in time with the same wrongness he had felt radiating from the corrupted rune weeks earlier, except vastly, unmistakably larger. "That's them," Kiba murmured, weapon already drawn. The Ashbourne Circle. At the formation's center stood a figure Issei recognized immediately, The same woman who had confronted him in the courtyard and again in the park, her posture unhurried even now, even at the edge of completing whatever plan she had spent this much time patiently building toward. She's leading the ritual herself, Sona whispered, having insisted on joining the direct approach despite Surzex's initial objections. That confirms she's more senior in the circle's hierarchy than we initially assumed. How much longer until the convergence peaks? Rias asked. Minutes, based on the energy signature. Maybe less. Azazel's expression had gone hard and focused, all traces of his usual dry humor entirely absent now that the moment had actually arrived. If we're going to disrupt this, it needs to be now, before the last alignment locks the ritual into something none of us can safely interrupt. Rias did not hesitate. Then we move. Kiba, Kaneko, take the flanks and draw as many of their operatives away from the central circle as you can. Aquino, Asia, stay close to Issei and me. We go straight for the center and stop this before it finishes. The plan held for exactly as long as it took the Ashbourne circle to notice their approach, which was not long at all. The woman at the formation center looked up the moment Rias's peerage broke from the tree line, and her expression, rather than showing alarm, sharpened into something almost pleased. Right on schedule, she said, voice carrying easily across the courtyard despite the growing pressure in the air. I was beginning to worry you'd disappoint me by staying home. Stop the ritual, Rias called back, power already gathering at her fingertips. Whatever you think you're going to unleash tonight, it ends here. It doesn't, actually. The woman gestured, almost lazily, and the robed figures around her broke formation, several peeling away to intercept the approaching group while the rest maintained their positions around the central circle, clearly under instruction not to let the ritual itself be disrupted regardless of what happened at its edges. You're welcome to try, of course. I did warn Issei, weeks ago, that others less patient than myself were coming. Consider tonight the culmination of exactly that patience. The fight broke out before she finished speaking, Kiba and Kaneko peeling off to engage the flanking operatives exactly as instructed, Aquino unleashing a bolt of lightning toward the nearest robed figure blocking their path to the circle's center. Issei summoned the boosted gear, its familiar weight settling over his arm, and drove forward alongside Rias as she cut a path through the resistance with a ferocity he had rarely seen from her, crimson power scattering opponents who had clearly underestimated exactly how seriously the Gremory heir intended to defend what she had spent these weeks preparing to protect. They reached the edge of the central circle with the woman still standing calm at its heart, the ritual's energy building visibly now, the air itself beginning to shimmer with a wrongness that made Issei's stomach twist with something closer to primal fear than tactical concern. Last chance, Rias said, power still gathered and ready at her fingertips. Stop this now, and we'll consider showing you the same courtesy you claim to have shown Issei in that park. I'm afraid that offer came a little too late. The woman raised both hands, and the symbols beneath her feet flared bright, the pressure in the air spiking sharply enough that Issei felt his knees nearly buckle under the sudden weight of it. The convergence has already peaked. The ritual is already complete. All that's left now, Rias Gremory, is for you to watch what your patience and your caution cost this town, and to understand, in the moments before it happens, exactly how thoroughly you failed to stop it. The ground beneath the shrine's central circle began to crack, thin fissures of pale light spreading outward from its heart, and somewhere deep beneath them, in the ancient dark where something patient and hungry had slept for centuries, the Ashen Sovereign finally, after all this time, began to stir. The light spreading through the cracked ground did not erupt into violence, the way Issei had braced for. Instead it rose slowly, almost gently, a column of pale ash-colored radiance climbing toward the night sky, and within it, gradually taking shape the way smoke takes shape in stillness before scattering, something vast and formless began to gather itself into the barest suggestion of a form. That's it, Azazel said, voice tight, arriving at Rias's side with Surzex close behind him, both having broken off from containing the shrine's outer perimeter the moment the fissures spread. That's the Ashen Sovereign, waking after all this time. The woman at the circle's center watched the rising light with something close to reverence, her earlier composed calm finally cracking into open, unguarded triumph. Do you feel it? She asked, not quite to any of them specifically, more to the night itself. After a century of patience, after generations of the circle keeping faith with a plan most of the current world dismissed as a fading grudge, it's finally awake. It's not fully manifested yet, Sona called out, having caught up with a fresh reading from whatever instrument she had been monitoring the ley line convergence with. The ritual completed the unsealing, but the entity itself needs time to fully cross over. If we can disrupt the anchor point before that crossing finishes, there's still a chance to force it back. How much time? Rias demanded. I don't know. Minutes, possibly less. Sirzex moved without further discussion, crimson power gathering around him with an intensity that made the very air ripple, and struck directly at the column of rising light with a force that Issei had never seen him deploy before, not even in the earlier, calmer council meetings where his authority had always felt more implied than demonstrated. The strike connected with a sound like the sky itself tearing, and for a moment the column of light staggered, the barely formed shape within it flickering like a candle caught in sudden wind. The woman at the circle's center screamed something that was not quite language, and the robed figures still standing around the perimeter surged forward as one, no longer bothering with the earlier restraint that had kept several of them guarding the ritual rather than fighting directly. Kiba and Kaneko, still engaged with the flanking operatives, found themselves suddenly facing reinforcements, and the fight around the shrine's edge sharpened into something considerably more desperate. Issei, Rias said, turning to him with an urgency that cut through everything else happening around them, the anchor point Sona mentioned. If we can reach it and disrupt it directly, we might be able to force the sovereign back before it fully crosses. But it's going to require getting close enough to the center of that light to do it, and I don't know what happens to whoever tries. Then I'll be the one who tries, Issei said, already moving before she could argue. Issei, wait. He did not wait. The boosted gear pulsed hot along his arm as he sprinted toward the column of rising light, weaving past a robed figure who lunged to intercept him, driving a boosted strike into the operative's side hard enough to send them sprawling before continuing forward without breaking stride. The pressure radiating from the light intensified with every step closer, pressing against him like a physical weight, and somewhere within the barely formed shape at its heart, something vast and ancient seemed to notice him for the first time, a slow, patient attention turning in his direction that felt older and colder than anything he had faced before. Boost, the gauntlet's voice intoned, sharper now, almost urgent, and Issei felt the surge answer something deep and stubborn in him, the same refusal that had carried him through every impossible fight since the moment he first put on that gauntlet. He reached the edge of the circle's center, close enough now to see the anchor point Sona had described, a small, unassuming stone half buried at the base of the light's column, pulsing in time with the rising radiance above it. He drove his gauntlet fist toward it without hesitation, and the impact, when it landed, sent a shockwave rippling outward that staggered everyone still standing within the shrine's courtyard, friend and enemy alike. The column of light shuddered violently, the barely formed shape within it flickering and distorting, and for one suspended moment Issei thought the strike had worked, that the entity would be forced back into whatever fragile containment remained of its centuries-old seal. Then the light surged instead of receding, and the vast, patient attention he had felt turning toward him sharpened suddenly into something focused, deliberate, and entirely, unmistakably aware. Interesting, said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, ancient and hollow and curious in a way that made Issei's blood run cold. A vessel. How thoroughly unexpected. The light around the anchor point flared blinding bright, and the last thing Issei saw before it swallowed his vision entirely was Rias's face, twisted with fear, already sprinting toward him across the shrine's courtyard, too far away to reach him before the light closed over everything. The light receded as quickly as it had risen, and when Issei's vision cleared, he found himself still standing at the shrine's center, the anchor stone now dark and inert beneath his feet, the great column of ash-colored radiance gone entirely from the night sky above. For one disoriented moment he thought the strike had somehow succeeded after all, that whatever ancient attention had turned toward him had simply been driven back into its broken seal. Then he felt it, coiled somewhere deep inside his own chest alongside the familiar, comfortable weight of the boosted gear, something vast and cold and entirely unwelcome, watching him from the inside with the same patient curiosity its voice had carried a moment before. Issei. Rias reached him first, catching him as his knees buckled under a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with the fight, and everything to do with whatever had just happened to him. Issei, look at me. What happened? It's still here, he managed, voice unsteady. Inside me. I don't know how, but it's still here. Azazel arrived a moment later, already running some manner of diagnostic casting over him with sharp, focused urgency, his expression darkening with every passing second of the assessment. The strike didn't force it back into the seal. It forced it to find a new vessel instead, and given the timing, given the fact that you were the only one close enough to the anchor point when the crossing completed, it looks like the Sovereign chose you rather than risk being severed from this world entirely. Chose him, Rias repeated, horror creeping into her voice. You mean it's bound to him now? The way the heart glass was. Not quite the same, Azazel said, though the distinction offered little comfort given his expression. The heart glass was a relic amplifying something already present. This is an ancient, sentient entity occupying space alongside the boosted gear inside his own soul. I don't fully understand the mechanics of how that's even possible yet, but I can tell you it's considerably more dangerous than anything we've dealt with so far. Across the courtyard, the fight around the shrine's perimeter had stuttered to an uncertain halt, both sides absorbing the shift in circumstances. The woman who had led the ritual stared at Issei with an expression caught somewhere between fury and fascination, the triumph she had worn moments earlier curdling into something far more calculating. Well, she said slowly, circling closer despite the wary weapons still raised around her. That's not the outcome I expected, but I find I'm not entirely displeased by it either. A vessel with a sacred gear already resident, containing an entity that consumes potential and possibility. I wonder what that particular combination might be capable of, given the right circumstances. Stay away from him, Rias snapped, crimson power flaring back to life around her hands despite her exhaustion. I don't need to come any closer, Gremory heir. The Circle's work here tonight was never actually about fully releasing the Sovereign into open rampage, whatever you all assumed while racing to stop us. It was about finding it a vessel patient enough, stubborn enough, and yes, sentimental enough, to eventually be convinced to use what it now carries on our behalf. She smiled, and for the first time Issei understood, with a cold clarity that settled deep into his chest, that everything since the heart glass, every careful step of this operation, had been building toward exactly this moment, exactly this outcome. You wanted a lever to move the Gremory heir. Consider this a rather more permanent one. Get out, Sirzek said, arriving at last from the shrine's outer perimeter, voice carrying an authority that made even the remaining Ashborn operatives instinctively step back. Whatever plan you thought you were completing tonight, it isn't finished the way you intended, and you will not be given the opportunity to refine it further on this ground. The woman studied him for a long moment, weighing the odds with the same patient calculation she had shown throughout, and finally inclined her head in something almost like acknowledgement. Perhaps not tonight. But patience has served the Circle well for over a century, king of the underworld. We can afford to wait a little longer for the vessel to fully understand what it's now carrying. Her gaze slid back to Issei one final time, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Take care of yourself, Dragon Boy. You've just become considerably more interesting than you ever were before. She was gone before anyone could stop her, the remaining Ashborn operatives melting away into the darkness beyond the shrine's boundary with practiced, unhurried efficiency, leaving behind only the shattered remains of their ritual circle and the cold, patient weight now settled permanently inside Issei's chest. Rias held on to him as the adrenaline of the fight finally began to drain away, her grip fierce and unwilling to loosen even slightly. We're going to figure this out, she said, more to herself than to him, the same fierce certainty she had carried through every crisis since the very beginning. Whatever it takes, whatever it's going to require, I am not losing you to something they planted inside you on purpose. I know, Issei said, though the cold, ancient attention still coiled somewhere inside his own chest made the reassurance harder to fully believe than he wanted it to be. We'll figure it out. Together. Above the shattered shrine, the last of the ley line convergence faded slowly from the night sky, leaving behind an ordinary darkness that felt, for the first time in weeks, considerably less safe than it had ever seemed before. The days following the shrine returned the club to a fragile approximation of normal, though nothing about it felt entirely settled anymore. Azazel spent every spare hour running diagnostics on whatever now shared space inside Issei alongside the boosted gear, careful, methodical sessions that left Issei drained and unsettled but produced, slowly, a clearer picture of exactly what the Ashbourne Circle had managed to do. "It's not fully awake," Azazel explained, during one such session in the clubroom, Rias and Sona both listening with the same tight focus they had brought to every briefing since the ritual. "The Sovereign is bound to you now the way a passenger is bound to a vehicle, present, aware, capable of exerting pressure, but not yet in control, and I don't believe it can take control unless you either invite it to or become weak enough that it no longer needs your permission to act." "What does it want?" Rias asked. "I've been listening," Issei said quietly, the admission costing him something to voice aloud. "Since the shrine. It doesn't talk exactly, not the way that voice spoke that first night. It's more like an impression, a hunger underneath everything, patient the same way the circle described it as being patient. It wants to be let out. It wants to consume the way it apparently always has. And it's watching, I think, waiting to see if I'll ever be desperate enough to let it." "You won't be," Rias said, immediate and fierce, her hand finding his without hesitation. "I don't intend to be," Issei agreed. "But I won't pretend it isn't there, or that it isn't patient in exactly the way the circle is patient. It's not going anywhere on its own, and I don't think Azazel's diagnostics alone are going to be enough to remove it the way the heart glass fragment was eventually removed." Azazel's expression confirmed the grim shape of that assessment before he spoke it aloud. "He's right. The heart glass was a foreign object, something that could be extracted because it never truly belonged to him in the first place. The Sovereign found a vessel through the ritual's crossing, and vessel bonds of that nature aren't extraction candidates the same way. If we want to separate them eventually, we're likely looking at something closer to the original sealing process. A binding constructed specifically for the two of them, strong enough to keep the Sovereign contained within him without needing his constant will to hold the line." "Is that even possible?" Sona asked. "Building a seal specific enough for a bond that's never existed before? Possible, probably. Difficult, certainly. I won't have an answer on how difficult until I've had considerably more time to study exactly how the bond formed and what it's currently doing inside him." Azazel rubbed at his eyes, exhaustion evident after days of near-constant research. "In the meantime, the most important thing any of us can do is exactly what we've already been doing. Keep him grounded. Keep him surrounded by people and reasons strong enough that the Sovereign's patience never finds an opening worth exploiting." Rias absorbed that with the same steady resolve she had carried through every crisis so far, though Issei could see, in the careful way she held herself, exactly how much this particular danger frightened her differently than anything that had come before it. The hard glass had been an external threat, something to fight against from the outside. This was something living inside the person she loved, patient and waiting, and there was no clean, decisive strike that could simply end it the way Rias had ended every other threat with fierce, direct action. "Then that's what we do," she said finally. "We keep him grounded. We give the Sovereign nothing to work with. And we find whoever's studied binding rituals thoroughly enough to help Azazel build something strong enough to finally settle this properly, however long that takes." Serzex, who had been quietly listening from near the window through most of the discussion, finally spoke. "I know someone who might help with that specific problem. It will require calling in a debt I've been saving for something considerably more dire than this, but I think this qualifies." His gaze settled on Issei with an unexpected warmth beneath the gravity of the conversation. "You held that thing off at the anchor point long enough to keep it from crossing fully into open rampage, Issei. Whatever it's cost you since, that action alone likely saved this entire town from a far worse outcome than the one we're currently managing. I don't intend to let that sacrifice go unanswered." "Thank you," Issei said, and meant it, though the cold, patient weight still coiled inside his chest made even genuine gratitude feel harder to hold on to fully than it once had. The meeting wound down as evening settled over Kuoh once more, everyone dispersing to their own private processing of exactly how much had changed in the span of a single fraught night, and Issei found himself, not for the first time, deeply grateful for the steady, unwavering presence of the people who had chosen, again and again, to stand beside him through whatever came next, ancient hungry entities included. Surzex's contact arrived 4 days later, an elderly seal crafter named Alphara who had, according to Surzex's careful introduction, personally studied under one of the original artificers who helped construct the sovereign's first binding centuries earlier. She examined Issei with the same clinical, unhurried thoroughness as Azazel had shown, though her methods involved considerably more direct contact, her weathered hands tracing patterns along his sternum that made the cold presence inside him stir with something like wary attention. "It's young, as these bonds go," she said finally, straightening with the careful movements of someone whose joints had long since stopped forgiving sudden motion. "New enough that a proper binding still has a fighting chance of holding, provided we build it correctly, and provided the boy himself remains as grounded as everyone in this room seems to believe he is." "How long will it take?" Rias asked, standing close beside Issei with the same fierce protectiveness she had shown since the shrine. "Weeks, not days. This isn't a working I intend to rush, given what happens if it fails partway through." Aphara's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on each face present with an appraising thoroughness. "I'll need all of you, incidentally. A binding this specific doesn't just require the crafter's skill. It requires anchors, people whose connection to the vessel is strong and genuine enough to give the seal something real to hold on to, the same way the original binding drew its strength from the ley line convergence itself. Devils, a sacred gear wielder, a fallen angel, all of you already gathered around him for reasons that have nothing to do with convenience. That's exactly the kind of foundation this working needs." "We're ready," Rias said, without hesitation, and around the room the rest of the peerage murmured similar agreement, none of them requiring further persuasion. Aphra allowed herself a small, weathered smile, the first real warmth she had shown since arriving. "Good. Then we begin tomorrow, and we continue every day after until it's finished properly. In the meantime," her gaze settled on Issei directly, "I want you to understand something the Circle almost certainly hoped you never would. What they placed inside you assumed it was claiming a vessel defined by isolation, by desperation, by exactly the kind of hollow, lonely hunger the sovereign itself embodies. It assumed wrongly. You've spent these last weeks building something considerably harder for a hungry, ancient thing to work with. A vessel surrounded, deliberately and thoroughly, by connection instead of isolation. That's going to matter more than any of you currently understand, before this working is finished." The weeks that followed passed in a steady, demanding rhythm, daily sessions with Aphra layering the new binding carefully into place, each one leaving Issei drained but steadier than the last, the cold, patient presence inside him gradually settling into something more contained, more manageable, though never fully silent. Rias remained close through every session exactly as she had promised, and the rest of the peerage rotated through their own roles in the working with the same quiet, determined commitment they had shown through everything since the very first strange morning that had started all of this. On the evening the final layer of the binding settled into place, Aphra straightened from her work with visible, exhausted satisfaction, and pronounced, with the careful authority of someone who did not offer false reassurance, that the sovereign was as contained as centuries-old craft and modern devotion combined could manage. "It will still be there," she cautioned, gathering her tools with slow, deliberate movements. "Bound, quiet, unable to act without his active consent. But present, the way old scars remain present long after the wound itself has healed. Whether that presence ever grows dangerous again depends entirely on whether the foundation this binding rests on holds. Connection. Purpose. Whatever it is that makes a vessel worth more, to the people around him, than whatever a hungry, ancient thing might offer in exchange for surrender." She left Kuoh the following morning, her debt to Surzex settled, and the schoolhouse gradually returned to something that felt, for the first time in weeks, genuinely peaceful rather than merely a pause between crises. Issei stood on the familiar rooftop that evening with Rias beside him, the cold presence inside his chest quiet now, contained, no longer an active weight pressing against every private moment. "How do you feel?" Rias asked. "Steadier," he admitted, and found it was true. "Not free of it, exactly. But steadier than I have been since the shrine." "That's enough for now," Rias said, leaning into him with the same easy, unguarded warmth that had grown between them across every strange, dangerous week since the heart glass first rewrote his morning. The Ashbourne Circle is still out there. Whatever else they're planning, we haven't seen the last of them. But tonight, I think we've earned the right to simply stand here together and let that be enough, just for a little while. Below them, Kuoh settled into its familiar evening quiet, streetlights glowing steady over roads that had no idea how close they had come to losing far more than any of their ordinary residents would ever fully understand, and Issei, standing beside the people who had chosen, again and again, to anchor him against everything an ancient hunger and a patient enemy had tried to make of him, found himself, for the first time in a long while, genuinely and unreservedly at peace. Life at Kuoh Academy settled, in the weeks after Afra's departure, into something Issei had almost forgotten was possible, an ordinary rhythm of classes and club meetings and quiet evenings that carried none of the constant, grinding tension of the preceding months. He still felt the sovereign's presence occasionally, a faint cold weight stirring at the edges of particularly stressful moments, but it remained exactly as contained as Afra had promised, a scar rather than an open wound, manageable in a way that no longer defined every hour of his day. Sona's research into the Ashbourne Circle continued in the background, methodical and unhurried now that the immediate crisis had passed, piecing together fragments of the organization's broader structure and history in preparation for whatever confrontation might eventually come next. Azazel split his time between Kuoh and his own quiet investigations elsewhere, occasionally returning with new findings that added detail without yet offering anything close to a complete picture of the Circle's remaining plans. Rias, for her part, seemed lighter than Issei had seen her since the very beginning of the heart glass crisis, the fierce, watchful tension she had carried through every council and every battle finally easing, at least for now, into something closer to genuine contentment. She still trained relentlessly, still reviewed Sona's reports with careful attention, but she also, more often than not lately, simply allowed herself to enjoy an ordinary afternoon, walking home from school with Issei without either of them scanning the streets for hidden threats, sharing meals in the clubroom that felt like meals rather than strategy sessions disguised as one. "I keep waiting for the next disaster," Issei admitted one such afternoon, the two of them sitting together on the clubroom's familiar sofa while Aquino hummed softly over a fresh pot of tea nearby. "It feels strange, having a quiet week." "I know what you mean." Rias leaned her head against his shoulder, unhurried in a way that had become easier and easier for both of them since the bindings settled into place. "But I think we're allowed this, Issei. Whatever the Ashbourne Circle is planning next, whatever they're patient enough to wait for, we spent the last several months proving that patience isn't a weapon that works unopposed against people who choose to stay close to each other through it. I'd like to enjoy that victory for a while, rather than spending every quiet moment bracing for the next one." "Fair enough," Issei said, and found, watching the afternoon light stretch gold and easy across the clubroom floor, that he meant it entirely. It was Kiba, 3 days later, who brought the quiet interlude to its natural end, arriving at the clubroom with an expression that immediately drew everyone's attention away from whatever ordinary task had been occupying the room. "Sona just forwarded something," he said, holding up a sealed message bearing the distinctive crest of the Angelic Faction's Northern Archive, the same office that had, months earlier, unwittingly handed the Ashbourne Circle their final key. "The caretaker who authorized the mirror's release has gone missing. No trace, no explanation, just an empty office and a note addressed specifically to Rias Gremory." Rias sat up sharply, all the easy contentment of the past weeks replaced instantly by the same sharp, focused attention Issei had come to associate with every serious threat the club had faced since this had all begun. "What does the note say?" Kiba's expression tightened further as he read it aloud. "It says, quote, 'The 7 keys were only ever the opening move, and the caretaker's absence is meant as a courtesy, a reminder that the Ashbourne Circle has patience enough for whatever comes next, and resources reaching considerably further than a single quiet town's borders.' It's signed with a single word. Ashbourne." The room went quiet, the fragile, hard-won peace of the past weeks settling into something more watchful, more braced, though not, Issei noted, afraid in the way the earliest days of the heart glass crisis had left everyone feeling. This time, whatever came next, They would meet it already knowing exactly what they were capable of when they chose to stand together against it. Rias rose from the sofa, some of her earlier ease replaced by the familiar, steady resolve that had carried them through everything so far, and looked around the room at the peerage that had, through months of relic curses and ancient bindings and one very long, very strange beginning, become considerably more than simply the people fighting alongside her. "Then we get to work," she said. "Whatever the Ashbourne Circle's next move looks like, we're not walking into it blind, and we're not walking into it unprepared. We've earned that much, at least, from everything we've already survived together." Outside the clubroom window, the afternoon light continued its slow, golden descent toward evening, indifferent as always to the quiet, determined plans already forming within, and somewhere far beyond Kuoh's familiar borders, the next chapter of the Ashbourne Circle's long, patient game was already, unhurried and certain, beginning to unfold. Surzex arrived within the hour of Kiba's discovery, summoned by an urgent message from Sona the moment the note's contents had been fully verified, and this time he did not bother with the careful, measured pacing he had brought to earlier councils. He read the message twice, his expression darkening steadily with each pass, before finally setting it down on the clubroom table with deliberate, controlled precision. "A missing caretaker and a direct message to my sister," he said, "is not a subtle move. The Ashbourne Circle spent over a century being patient and careful precisely because they understood the value of operating unnoticed. This is the opposite of that. This is a declaration." "Why show their hand now?" Rias asked. "They had us at a disadvantage at the shrine. Why reveal themselves so openly after that, rather than simply continuing to work in the shadows?" "Because the shrine didn't go the way they wanted, whatever their leader claimed at the time," Azazel said, arriving mid-discussion with a stack of fresh notes gathered from his own quiet investigations over the preceding weeks. "They intended to fully release the sovereign, or at minimum to control its crossing far more cleanly than what actually happened. Instead they ended up with a bound, contained entity riding inside a sacred gear wielder who spent the following weeks surrounded by exactly the kind of support network that makes him considerably harder to manipulate than they clearly assumed he would be. I think this message is less a declaration of confidence, and more an attempt to rattle us into reacting carelessly." "Then we don't react carelessly," Sona said, already pulling out fresh pages of research, the brief interlude of quiet clearly over as far as she was concerned. "We treat this exactly the way we treated the heart glass and the shrine both. Methodically. With preparation ahead of confrontation rather than the reverse." Surzex nodded slowly, some of the immediate tension in his posture easing into something more considered. "Agreed. I'll increase the search for the missing caretaker through official channels, though I suspect the Circle is skilled enough to have left very little trace to follow. In the meantime, I want to know everything we can determine about what happens next in their plan. If the 7 keys and the Sovereign's Crossing were only the opening move, as their note claims, then we need to understand what the following moves might look like before they're already underway." "I have a theory," Azazel said, spreading his notes across the table with the particular grim focus he had shown throughout the crisis's more serious turns. "The old records I've been studying mention the Ashen Sovereign as one of several experiments from the war's final years, not the only one. If the Circle's ultimate goal was never simply releasing a single ancient entity, but rather demonstrating that such experiments could be successfully reclaimed and controlled, then this might only be a proof of concept. A test case, meant to establish a method they intend to repeat elsewhere, with other, equally dangerous bindings scattered across other territories." The weight of that possibility settled heavily over the room. Issei, listening from where he sat beside Rias, felt the cold presence in his chest stir faintly at the discussion, not threatening exactly, but attentive, aware in the same patient way it had been since the shrine. "If that's true," Rias said slowly, "then this was never just about Kuoh. It was a demonstration for something considerably larger." "That's my growing suspicion," yes, Azazel confirmed. "Which means whatever the Circle intends to attempt next, we should assume it's not going to stay confined to a single quiet town's borders indefinitely. We may be looking at the opening stages of something that threatens considerably more than the town all of you have spent these months defending." Surzex rose from his seat, the full weight of his authority settling visibly back over his bearing now that the conversation had moved from immediate crisis management into longer-term strategic concern. Then I'll need to bring this to the full council, not simply keep it contained to Kuoh's defense. If the Ashbourne Circle is preparing to repeat this method elsewhere, every territory bordering a similarly old binding needs to be warned and prepared. His gaze moved around the room, settling last on Issei with an expression that carried both gravity and something like genuine respect. And I want your account of what happened at the anchor point included in that briefing, Issei, in detail. Whatever you experienced in that moment when the sovereign first tried to claim you fully, it may be the single most valuable piece of information we have about how to prevent the circle from succeeding more completely the next time they attempt this. Issei nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling alongside the familiar, contained presence in his chest, and found himself, despite the daunting scale of what Azazel's theory suggested, steadied rather than shaken by the trust being placed in him. Whatever I can tell you, I will, he said. We've come this far by facing things together instead of separately. I don't see any reason that should change now, just because the scale of what we're facing turned out to be bigger than any of us first assumed. Rias's hand found his beneath the table once more, the same steady anchor it had been through every crisis since the very beginning, and around the room, the rest of the peerage settled into the same quiet, determined focus that had carried them through the hard glass, through the shrine, and through every dangerous turn in between. Outside, evening deepened fully into night over Kuoh, and somewhere far beyond its borders, across territories none of them had yet begun to fully consider, the Ashbourne Circle's long, patient game continued its slow, deliberate unfolding, one careful move at a time. Later that night, after the council had dispersed into the fresh work Surzex's warning had set in motion, Issei found Asia waiting for him near the clubroom door, her expression carrying the same quiet, thoughtful attentiveness she had shown him weeks earlier, before the shrine had changed the shape of everything that followed. You're worried, she said, not quite a question. A little, he admitted. It's strange. I thought once the binding settled, once Afra finished her work, that the hardest part would be over. Now it sounds like we've barely seen the beginning of whatever the circle's actually planning. Maybe. Asia fell into step beside him as they walked out into the cool night air, the schoolhouse's windows glowing warm behind them. But I think you're stronger for everything that's already happened, even the parts that were frightening while they were happening. You're not facing this the way you were facing the heart glass, alone and confused about what was even happening to you. You understand the shape of the danger now. You have people around you who understand it too. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Issei considered that, the cold, contained presence in his chest quiet and unthreatening in the stillness of the evening. It does, he said finally. I think you might be right. I usually am, about this sort of thing, Asia said, with a small, genuine smile that eased some of the evening's remaining weight from his shoulders. Get some rest, Issei. Whatever comes next, I don't think it's going to arrive tonight. She left him at the schoolhouse gate, and Issei stood alone for a moment beneath the quiet night sky, the ordinary sounds of Kuoh settling into its familiar late evening rhythm around him. Somewhere behind him, the clubroom's lights still burned steady, Sona and Surzex undoubtedly still deep in the work Azazel's theory had set in motion, and somewhere further beyond the town's borders, an old, patient enemy continued its slow, careful preparations for whatever came next. But for tonight, at least, the danger remained distant, held at bay by exactly the kind of steady, deliberate connection Afra had promised would matter more than any of them fully understood, and Issei walked home beneath the quiet stars with the settled, hard-won knowledge that whatever the Ashbourne Circle intended to attempt next, they would not be facing it as easily as they clearly still believed. He let himself into the house quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and paused for a long moment in the doorway of his own room, the same water-stained ceiling above him that had greeted him on that first strange morning months ago, back when the whole of this had begun with nothing more alarming than the smell of miso soup and a voice downstairs that did not belong to his mother. It felt, standing there now, like a lifetime ago, and in some ways it had been. He was not the same person who had stumbled down those stairs that morning, confused and unmoored by a world that had rearranged itself around him without his consent. He understood now, in a way he had not then, exactly what it meant to be chosen deliberately by the people around him, rather than simply desired by a curse's careless amplification, and he understood, too, exactly what it was going to take to keep protecting that choice against whatever patient, ancient enemy still worked, unhurried and certain, somewhere beyond the edges of everything he could currently see. He closed his eyes that night with the cold, contained presence in his chest quiet and still, and slept, for the first time in what felt like a very long while, without dreaming of anything at all. Somewhere near dawn, half surfacing from sleep without fully waking, he thought he heard, faint and distant, the echo of a voice that did not belong to anyone in his house, patient and old and endlessly, quietly watching. He did not open his eyes to chase it. He simply reached, in the drowsy space between sleep and waking, for the memory of Rias's hand in his, steady as it had always been, and let that steadiness carry him back down into rest, undisturbed, until the ordinary light of morning finally arrived to greet him, carrying with it, as it always seemed to lately, another day worth staying awake and ready for.